And I thought that what I would like to do tonight is, instead of asking you questions, because we have spent the last 10 days, we've asked you questions, you've all given individual presentations, I would like to instead go through a very large number of issues here and see what we have consensus on. So instead of asking for the details and each person spending 10 minutes talking about butter, I'd rather get a consensus to show what we do have a consensus on. Now, there is one issue that I want to point out in advance. Pam, Julieanna, and Garth are in the business of trying to help people. And so they give advice that they believe is realistic to help people. Brian and Anna Maria have a center that people come to. So they have a tremendous amount of control over what is served at that center. So for them, the right answer to something might be take wheatgrass juice because they serve it there and they could make sure it gets done. So you might find there's a difference that Brian and Anna Marie have very specific protocol that works fantastic. However, because they have control over people that see them, they're very comfortable recommending it. Where Pam, Julieanna, and Garth are dealing with people on their own in their own homes, and they to some degree understand there are certain limitations of what they expect people to follow. So it might be that Brian and Anna Marie is saying incredibly accurate, brilliant information, but it might be that other speakers feel like their patients are not ready to take that step. So it's fantastic to take the step into whole food plant-based nutrition, whether or not you go to the more, I don't want to use the word extreme, but the more advanced step of sprouting your lentil before eating it, that's something else. So I think that there are differences in what you'll hear, but there's full agreement that taking an approach of a whole food plant-based diet is the approach. So again, my goal here is consensus. It's very powerful if people here see 5 people say yes or no to something. So I would ask that you refrain from speaking for more than 30 seconds on any topic. Just say yes. Just say yes or no, and just no more than 30 seconds. If you have no comment on it, that would be fine if you don't want to comment. But I would like to demonstrate if there is consensus, and if not, that's fine as well. So I'm going to I have a list here of 100 points, and I really would like to try to go through them and just see if we could demonstrate consensus. Also, my goal here is not to give people a deep education. My goal is to get right down to the bottom line, because everyone's leaving and they're going to have breakfast and then lunch and then dinner. And I want them to hear not the details of why, but what you are actually, assume they're trusting you. And so we want to hear your conclusion. So here we go, no more than 30 seconds. What are your thoughts about eggs, including free-range organic eggs?
There's no such thing as free-range eggs. They're all horrifically bad. The only creature that's able to digest them is a fox. They have the adequate enzymes. Each egg has 230 grams of cholesterol, and if you boil it in vinegar, you can take the shell off and bounce it like a rubber ball.
No, to me, eggs is a chicken. I won't eat chickens.
The healthiest people on the planet in their own environment are not vegan, and so we don't teach a vegan diet to everybody. We teach a plant-based diet to everybody, which allows for very tiny amounts, very specific tiny amounts, 2 to 3 servings a week of animal food, as long as it's organic or wild caught, and it can include eggs.
I too see eggs as liquid chickens and see all the horrible stuff that happens to them, but also the fact that it's so concentrated as a source of protein and so concentrated in the yolk as a source of as cholesterol, so I do not recommend them.
I try to do everything I do in medicine based on science. And I feel the same, that this is a chicken. I think if we're doing it from an ethical reason, it's horrible because you've seen how chickens are raised. The science looks pretty clear that less than 6 eggs a week does not seem to be harmful I don't recommend eggs. I don't eat eggs myself, but I can't argue if my patients have a few eggs a week.
What about milk, cheese, yogurt, and butter?
They're all the same thing. They derive from milk. Some is with less water, some is with more water, some is a little fermented. And as the work has shown over the last 35 years or so, is that it's probably the #1 dietary cause of cancer. I know at the Hippocrates Institute for 60 years, no dairy food has been part of our program. And statistically, we win international awards. More people have reversed disease with us than any institute in the history of man.
You know, having worked with people with asthma and arthritis for so many years, I know dairy is absolutely a no-no for all of them, and of course for cancer, but it's not a food for human beings. It's for a calf to grow at least 700 pounds in a year, no matter how we try to get there. Believe me, it is not a good thing for us. We cannot digest it well. Being Scandinavian, we somehow been brainwashed that we can digest it, where 2/3 of the world's population absolutely cannot. So we kind of forced ourselves to digest it. But we pay a big price with cardiovascular, obesity, diabetes, cancer, you name it. Thank you.
I think a very strong case can be made to eliminate any animal milk, not just cow's milk, but people sometimes think that sheep's milk or goat's milk are better options, and they're not. The risk factors associated with consuming any type of dairy products are significant, so dairy is not a part of our eating plan.
The first food group I recommend people cut out of their diet for multiple different reasons is dairy. And I've seen dramatic improvements in people in terms of inflammatory conditions like asthma and eczema. It's a very significant impact on people's health. And yes, exactly, we are the only species to ever consume dairy after weaning and to consume dairy of another species. And I recommend strongly against it.
And we have a consensus. I'm surprised because I see a lot of South Indian vegetarians that are overweight and morbidly obese and come to me for surgery, and I look at their diet and it's so heavily dairy, and if I could just change that, they lose a lot of weight. And there's been some great studies on saturated fat using muffins, and there's no question that saturated fat is bad for you. It's just a bunch of media and industry influence that has started this idea. I could go on forever about saturated fat. It's not good for you, and it's heavy in this dairy, and I don't recommend dairy at all.
Just one more thing on the dairy. What about kefir? Does that change anything?
No, if you ferment something bad, it's bad fermented.
Okay. 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 All right. What about chicken?
Chicken's poultry. My next book, I'm starting December 1st, is going to expose the entire poultry industry. Again, there's no such thing as free-range poultry. That's a complete fraud. We're going to expose that. We're also going to show you that the brilliant work of Dr. Virginia Livingston of 62 years before her demise exposed that it was, as far as meats go, the #1 cause for all forms of cancer. You may want to look into Livingston's work.
So, the life of a chicken could be many, many years. The ethical part of just taking a life of an animal where they were supposed to be here on Earth for many, many years is just enough not to eat it, but there is nothing we need from the animal sources. There is nothing that we cannot get from the plant source.
I agree with that statement. However, and I would differentiate organic chicken from free-range chicken. We don't recommend free-range anything, but I think we all want the same thing, which is for the planet to last for a good long time and for people to eat a better diet. We have got to get people to do it. And when we go out with extreme messages that leave most people behind, we are not going to win people over to our cause. And so, just for the record, I eat a vegan diet. I don't eat chicken. I don't eat eggs. But if I want people to do better, we have to talk to people, first of all, based on science. Again, I'll come back to those rural Chinese eating some chicken eggs didn't know that they were supposed to get sick. They just eat tiny amounts of it. And that's the common denominator among populations around the world who still eat animal food. Whatever they're eating, whether it's fish or chicken or turkey or cow or whatever, it's a tiny, tiny amount, and generally it doesn't include dairy. So it's difficult to scientifically defend a vegan diet for all, including the inclusion of chicken. And I think we leave people behind when we insist that that's the only way to do it.
I see animal products very similarly, and the chicken is not much different nutritionally speaking as other red meats and other meats, because they are still high in saturated fat, still high in cholesterol, still high in hormones and antibiotics and all of those things that we know promote disease. It's also completely absent of phytochemicals and fiber, which are the two most health promoting nutrients that we could find only in plants. So I recommend people eat as close to a completely plant-based diet as possible. Ethically speaking, there's absolutely no reason to eat chickens. Absolutely, we can get all of that, the good stuff that you could find if the whatever is the saving value of why people recommend chicken over meat, you could still get all of that stuff with perfectly packaged in plants.
All right, I can't stand chicken. And I'll tell you why, because I like the little chickens, they're nice, but we've had a drop in our red meat consumption, but we've had a huge rise in chicken consumption. And Asia is seeing an absolute enormous rise in chicken, and chicken is thought of as a health food. But I showed you in the data today that in the EPIC Panacea study in Europe, chicken was the #1 food associated with weight gain over time. And my patients eat it because they think that it's supposed to make them lose weight, and yet they're gaining weight from it. It's a very strong correlation with lymphoma, very strong correlation with lymphoma. And I think that chicken gets a break when we go after red meat and processed meat, but we seem to leave chicken alone, though chicken is loaded with bacteria, loaded with endotoxins, loaded, it will rise your IGF-1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very anti-chicken, though I do agree with Pam that when you go to extremes, so when my patients, don't tell them to eat a vegan diet, but I'm not going to give chicken a break.
What about turkey?
Turkey and chicken the same. Turkey's actually worse.
Okay.
Turkey's actually worse. They have to artificially inseminate turkeys now. They are no longer the normal bodies they were maybe a couple of generations ago. So the hormonal distortion in that and the mutagenic effect is even higher than chicken.
What about lab meat if they develop it? It seems like they're claiming they're very close to developing lab hamburger. What about it?
Well, I haven't seen anything in the 45 years of work I've done that came out of a lab that was at all helpful. So I can't comment on something that doesn't exist, but it doesn't seem sensible to me.
Oh, I did see a picture of it. It looks disgusting. You know, and I don't. Why do we have to go to these extremes? You know, and we're looking like the way we grow grains and corn and soy and everything now, because we're like with genetic manipulation, with Monsanto thinking we got to grow tons. And the quality is just watered down when we do that because we use pesticides and fertilizers, and we pay a big price with cancer and all kinds of autism related, and you know it turns to a big epigenetic problem. So no, we sure don't want meat to be GMO made and made from laboratories. We don't need any such thing.
I think I haven't seen the product and can't vouch for what it is or isn't, but I think that the problem is that when people try to eat a better version of a terrible diet, they never end up better off. And so what we're doing when we suggest that if you're eating animal food 10 times a week, now you eat this lab-created animal food, we're missing the discussion that really needs to take place, which is that the entire dietary pattern needs to change. And if we don't have that discussion, then people aren't going to get better. I mean, the vast majority of people coming into my office they're trying to eat a health-promoting diet. They're doing it wrong. Like as Dr. Davis said, they're eating chicken instead of beef thinking that they're better off. Well, if you don't change anything except you're eating the lab meat instead of the other meat, and you're still consuming dairy and processed foods and junk and crap, and you've been dehydrated since 1972, I don't think you're going to be a whole lot better off. So that's my basic opposition to it. I can't really talk about the quality of it at this point, but I think we're missing the point.
I agree with all that. And from a nutritional standpoint, if it's identical to meat, then it's going to have the identical implications in your body. However, I have people that come to me all the time that say, I don't want to give this up. They just really don't want to give it up. So if they, or I don't even care, just give me a pill. I really have clients that say that to me. So the question then is, well, then you're going to do less damage to the environment and to the animals by eating a lab-grown version of this. And if you really don't care about your health and you're doing this because you just really don't care, and believe me, I see this all the time, then at least it's saving animals and saving, hopefully, environmental resources. I don't know the replications on the environment as of yet, though.
I don't know if you're going to ask us this, but it kind of ties back to this grass-fed meat. Like there's a type of meat that's a good meat and a type of meat that's bad. Now grass-fed meat has more omega-3, so it's slightly better. But, and I put this in my talk today, there's many reasons that meat is bad for you, and we know the mechanism of action. It raises IGF-1, whether it's a cow in a grass, whether it's a cow in a CAFO, or whether it's in a Petri dish. It has heme iron, whether it's in any of those scenarios. When it's grilled, because you're going to grill this meat eventually, it forms heterocyclic amines, which are a known carcinogen. I could go on and on and on. Heme, iron, new 5DC, all these things are still going to be in that lab meat, and they're still going to affect the human physiology the way any other animal does.
Let's go to beef. What about beef? And let's assume whether it's regular beef or grass-fed beef. How about beef in 30 seconds?
Well, it's so notably bad, I don't think we have to labor over that, but once again, when you cook it, you have a carcinogen that is apparent that comes on there, acrylamides that come on there, and you know, the saturated fat issue alone is enough to say no.
I think that the way that we produce that meat is awful. I think the feed for these animals is awful because it's usually GMO corn or soy, things that these animals would never touch if they were out in nature. And we get all these chemicals into us, and you know, a cow would have lived a long life.
For the record, I'll say that I am squarely in the camp of animal rights. If we could get everybody in the United States of America tomorrow to give up dairy and limit their animal food consumption to 2 or 3 servings a week of organic animal food or wild-caught fish, our problem would be over. Wouldn't be enough demand to have a factory farm anywhere. We would not have people sick. I mean, I think none is best. But here's the deal, you guys. We have got to market this to the American public. And one of the things that people say all the time is, I'm so frustrated, nobody will listen to me. Well, I wrote an editorial about this one time and got a lot of controversy about it. And if I overstate my 30 seconds, I promise it won't be by much, but I have to say this. Okay, if we were an organization called Plant-Based Nutrition and we were a for-profit business and we were trying to sell this to the public, and every day we came back to the office and said, nobody will buy what we're selling, how long are you going to blame it on the people you're talking to before you look at what you are talking about? Okay, we have got to find a way to get tens of millions of people to do this. Okay, we have to do that. And I will, you know, my company, to my knowledge, is the biggest company in the world that does what it does. We do this in 35 different countries. We have tens of thousands of people who pay us for information. If we took a harder stance on these issues, it wouldn't be that way, all right? So that's why I keep coming back to, I'm vegan, my friends are vegan, I think it's great, I'm an animal rights activist, but I have to sell this to people to get anything done.
I see them all very similar. I see the meat and the dairy and the chicken, and I mean, they all have very similar nutritional profiles. Of course, I'm always coming from a nutritional standpoint. They all have very similar ethical issues associated with it, and it's completely unnecessary. So I would put them all in the same camp. You know, I have clients that say, well, if it was, what was the least bad meat if I had to choose one? And so, you know, like you can get so nitpicky, but they're really all very similar. And it really isn't, all of these things, this palate for eating more and more of it and having the meat as the center of the plate is the wrong thinking. And we need to change the thinking and show people how delicious plant-based foods are. You don't need that hunk of meat in the center of your plate. And it goes for all the meats. I see them very, very similarly.
You know, all the paleo people are always like, well, they ate meat all the time, and I'm a paleo eater, so I'm going to eat a cow. A cow's not even remotely paleo. All right, it's not even close to what they used to eat, and they didn't eat tons of it. They were not having brontosaurus burgers for lunch and dinner. And so this idea that we should eat like our paleo ancestors eat just takes away this idea that we should be evolving. As everyone has said, we absolutely don't need to eat meat. We don't need leather. We've got fake leather. There's no need for it. And if there's no need for it, why am I going to eat or tell my patients to eat a known carcinogen? So I can't say this about chicken and dairy because it hasn't been done yet, but the World Health Organization has said unequivocally that processed meat is a class 1 carcinogen. And by the way, the other class 1 carcinogens are arsenic, asbestos, plutonium, and tobacco. And so it's on the level with that. And red meat is a class 2A, meaning it's probably a carcinogen. And so there's no way I could tell a patient to eat a carcinogen and feel good about it.
Before we go on, I want to make a statement or a comment. You said a couple of times, and this is a nice panel of people, and I'm happy to be like-minded, that it's extreme to tell people the ethical things. I don't think it's extreme to tell people what's right. No? Let me make a comment. Number 2, I'm happy you have a very successful business. I don't see this as a business. I see this as survival of the human race and survival of the planet Earth. So I take exception to the fact you think it's extreme to tell people the truth.
I think that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's extreme to tell people the truth. I'm saying that if we can't get people...
Water down the program so more people join the club.
I'm saying that if you can't get people
What that means. Explain what it means to me.
I was actually trying to do that, but I will now do it. What I was saying is that if you can't get people to do it, it doesn't matter what you're talking about. And one point I want to make, I think, I'm not telling people to eat animal food. What I'm basically saying is if you look at populations around the world, the rural Chinese, the northern Africans, they have very low disease rates. They are not eating a vegan diet. So if we're going to really adhere to the science, then we better get ourselves adhering to the science. I'm vegan. I don't talk anybody out of being vegan. But I care about the planet. I care about animals. And the more people we get to reduce their animal food intake, the more people we can get to join the club, the closer we are to achieving our goals. If people don't want to join the club, we have a big problem going on. And that's all I'm saying.
And I gotta say, you know, I get all fired up at these events, and you put me on stage and give me a mic, and I'll go crazy. But there's a big difference when if you've got a population. So people that go to Hippocrates, for instance, are very interested in this, and they're gonna adapt it. But I go into a room, and there's a 6'5", 280-pound, 290-pound cattle rancher, and if I say the word vegan, I've lost this guy forever. He's out. But if I could start talking to him, well, let's see what your diet is. Let's try this instead of that. Let's talk about eating more plants. How can we shift the plate? I'm much more successful. And so I don't get very extreme when I'm meeting with patients because Pam's absolutely right. You will lose the vast majority of the population. Whereas I would love to say, you know, I would love to slap him in the face and say, for the love of God, you've killed a beautiful animal and you're killing yourself and this is terrible. But it's just not going to work like that. We're not going to make the changes we need. I don't think it's watered down. I think it's very scientific to say this stuff. And they know I'm vegan and they know that I'm going to tell them bad stuff about it. But if I go too extreme with them, I lose them. And I've gone through, because when I first learned about this stuff, when I first read the original studies and started doing the science, I was like, for the love of God, the world needs to be vegan right this very second. And like the first patient I saw, I wanted to shake them and say, go vegan right now. But I started losing their interest. They started not listening. But now they listen a lot because I present science. I give them diet plans that are vegan. But I tell them, look, if you're going to add something in that's fine, but it needs to be a side dish here and here. And while that's not ideal, that's the only way in a medical practice you're going to make a difference. I see it on a day-to-day basis.
What about wild-caught fish, shrimp, lobster, clams, oysters?
In my book, Killer Fish, I addressed each and every one of those issues. No aquatic life was ever meant to be consumed. After removing it from the water within 20 minutes, the fats, saturated fats, and even the so-called omega oils, which are minimal in most of these aquatic life, are oxidized. That's a lipid peroxide. For 65 years, we've known that's a known carcinogen. When you cook it, it has another 2 or 3 added attractions to it being dangerous for you. In addition to that, we've almost fished out the oceans, and at this stage, as Einstein so wisely said, once all of the fish are gone, we have 5 years after it. The estimated date by the experts is 2048.
So, you know, we have polluted the ocean so much that even if you would like to fish, fish is not edible anymore. It's you can forget about shrimp and all the scavengers of the ocean that are full of chemicals. You know, in Florida here we have problems with algae growth and all kinds of chemical outlets from, of course, people have just poured tons of sewer stuff into the ocean. The thing is that if we stop commercial fishing, we might have a chance. But we all need to support that by not eating fish, by showing that we want that to stop so that fish can regrow and the ocean can get healthy again.
I agree. I will just come back to the thing that I said before, which is that it's dose dependent. So if we can get it down to 2 or 3 times a week, it's organic or wild caught, we will solve a lot of our problem. The other thing I'll mention, so we don't just keep repeating ourselves here, is that sometimes people are a little touchy about this being a business. But let me tell you why it's important for us to make this a business. Because from the outside looking in, we want health professionals all over the world to join in and start recommending this to their patients. And if they see us as a bunch of well-intentioned, passionate people living in our cars, it doesn't look so inviting to do this for a business. And so I've been unabashedly profitable at Wellness Forum Health because I want people to look at it and say, you know, if I decided to do, I no longer have to choose between doing the right thing and making money. I could actually do the right thing and make money, okay? I can put my kids through college, I can make my mortgage payment, I'll be able to drive an automobile, take a vacation next year. So I bristle a little bit when people think that if you talk about being successful, that's a bad thing. I think being successful is a good thing. It invites other people in to do this with their patients too.
Important issue. Also, I agree with everything here, but here's a little tester. So my mom is like, oh, I'm never gonna give up fish. And my dad, they're like, 20 years of me trying to get them to give up fish. And friends too. I'm like, okay, go get your mercury tested, because this is very easy to do. So all of those pollutants, I don't think we have PCB and dioxin tests. I don't know how sophisticated our medical testing is on those things, but I send my parents and people and clients that have fish, even like if they can't give up sushi or whatever, a couple times a week, or even once or a couple times a month or something. And you'd be shocked at how many people have elevated mercury in their blood. And that's enough to scare a lot of people. And it also says a lot about the pollutants actually getting in not so large of a dose. I mean, clearly we have a huge sustainability issue at our hands. I mean, the data, every day I read a new article about it, and it's terrifying because every species, we are all related, and it's going to affect the climate. As we're all seeing, I live in California, we're seeing the effects of this drought. It's horrifying. We haven't had water in years. And so it's a big issue. But you can, if people are scared about their health, which sometimes some people come to you specifically for that, not always, that's a good way to tell how much they're consuming and maybe make them think twice. And it makes my parents give up fish once in a while.
Yeah, when I first started reading the literature is very strong about meats, but it's not that strong against fish. And as Pam has said before, you look at some of the blue zones that I talked about earlier, just about all of them eat fish. Not all of them, but a lot of them eat fish. The Adventist Health study that you guys know that I think is the greatest study ever, the pescatarians actually did better than the vegans and vegetarians when it came to cancer. And they did just as well, or if not better, in some of the other studies when it came to heart issues. But a lot of these places are sourcing their fish a lot better. When I'm sitting down with a patient, I can't bring my ethics and the environment into the room. I don't know, we could have that argument. That's a whole other argument. I feel like I need to speak one-on-one with that patient about what's best for their health. In that situation, I tell them, look, the data on fish is that it's healthy for you 2 to 3 times a week. More than that, there tends to be a problem. Personally, when I learned about stuff and I looked at the pescatarian data, it looked so good. I started eating fish a lot. I went and got my mercury level checked, and it was 20. And I said to the doctor, what's it supposed to be? 0. And I was like, it's 20 at 0. Now it's 0. And what is that? We don't exactly know what the effect of that mercury is, but it's substantial. And the other thing that happens with fish is you say fish is good, so people go and buy tilapia that we know is laden with dioxins and PCBs and stuff like that. So my general recommendation for my patients is if you could you don't need it. You could be very healthy without it. If you're going to eat it, just eat it twice a week. Look for smaller fish, sustained fish. I hate saying wild caught because wild caught can be really dangerous to the environment too, with the long strings of wild caught where they get by catch. But anyway, the data, if you're going to go by science, a pescatarian diet does seem to be healthy. Though I do think the data, there's problems with the data that may be biasing it towards being healthy, and that I still think a vegan diet's healthier.
I'm going to talk about the omega-3s tomorrow, and that might be the one reason why it seems to be healthier in some of these studies, but there's ways to get it directly instead of indirectly and using the middle fish.
I do think it's the omega-3. I mean, in the end, I do think it's the omega-3, but you'll talk about that.
When we talk about science, science generally looks at mainstream methodologies and diet programs. They haven't done long-term studies on vegan diets yet. And so I've written a 3-volume series for the scientific community doing that, basically looking at about 75 years of data that pretty much put together the vegan diet and superseded all of these mainstream studies. And so you may be interested in reading them. That's Food is Medicine.
I mean, they've done long-term studies on vegans, actually. They've done quite a few. There's the Heidelberg German study, there's the EPIC Oxford study, there's the Adventist Health study. But there's lots of problems with them. So for instance, like in the Oxford vegan study, the vegans there were ethical vegans. If you look at their fiber intake, it was about 20 grams of fiber. So all of us up on this stage would never tell anybody to eat 20. I don't know how you could get just 20 grams of fiber on a vegan diet. You got to be eating Oreos all day. So these are not necessarily healthy vegans, okay? And when they looked at these vegans, their calcium intake was less than 500 milligrams. It's so easy to get calcium on a vegan diet. And they're not taking B12 supplementation, and they're not eating organic. So there are long-term studies on vegans, but I don't think they're good long-term studies on the kind of vegans that we're talking about. I mean, like the kind of people that go to Hippocrates and follow the diet that you would give them there is not the kind of vegans that are being studied, and that tends to make veganism look worse. The funny thing about the Oxford study is they weren't taking B12. They had low B12, which rises homocysteine level, which should give you heart disease. So did the vegans have heart disease? No, they had less heart disease than the meat eaters. And the funny thing is, in that study, the vegans were terribly eating a terrible diet. The meat eaters were the healthiest meat-eating people you've ever seen. They only ate meat like once a week or twice a week, and they were eating lots of fruits and vegetables. So they biased it so that the meat eaters would do better. They biased it so the vegans would do terribly. The vegans still beat the meat eaters.
Which whole grains do you recommend?
The ones that are commonly available would be teff, millet, quinoa, buckwheat, and amaranth.
These are the gluten-free grains. As I talked about earlier, gluten actually blocks iodine for your thyroid, so you sure don't want gluten. But you can sprout grains like barley, oats, and rye, and wheat, and actually get rid of the gluten. But of course, for most of us, the gluten-free grains, the millet, quinoa, amaranth, teff, is so much easier for you to digest.
I recommend any whole grains that my people will eat, unless they have a known gluten problem, celiac patients, IBD patients, that sort of thing. But any whole grain they'll eat is fine with me.
I second that. I recommend any whole grain you enjoy because there's so many delicious ones. I don't recommend gluten-free unless necessary. I see people that it's definitely necessary, but most people, they do better because they're simply not eating processed foods. And I don't recommend, eating a white bread diet. I recommend whole grains. So if that's wheat berries and couscous, and that does okay in your body, then you're probably fine with gluten. It just depends on what you like. There's so much variety, and it's a great way to substantiate a delicious diet and offer a lot of culinary diversity.
I think grains are one of they have been so wrongly targeted and one of the best superfoods out there. And what's amazing to me when we look around the world at different cultures, like Pam has talked about before, grains have been a staple of the healthiest cultures for years and years and years and years. And when I talked a little bit today about Tunisia. That was a grain-eating, wheat-eating, whole grain diet place that was extremely healthy till meat came along. But I can't, there's another conference going on right now, the Mind Body Green, and Pamela, what's his name, Pamela, was up there talking about how grains cause Alzheimer's. Absolutely the opposite. I mean, the science is very clear on this, that grains are the opposite effect with Alzheimer's. I think grains are fantastic. I think all grains are good. I could go on and on about gluten. I've done every study in the book on gluten in patients, and no inflammatory mediator changes. Nothing. And the guy who actually started the whole gluten craze has kind of gone back on it. He did a study, which is a placebo trial, where he had people that were gluten sensitive. He gave them muffins that had gluten in them, and he told them they didn't have gluten in them. And then they didn't have symptoms. Then he gave them muffins that did have gluten, and told them it didn't have gluten, or it didn't have gluten. They're like, oh no, I still have symptoms. If you look at the placebo trials on this, we've created what's called a nocebo effect, where we tell you that gluten is going to make you die, and then you touch gluten and you think that you're going to die. But I am not a big believer that gluten is a problem, and I just want people to eat their grains because it's such an important source of fiber and vitamins.
Well, one thing I'll just...
There was a study or an article I saw today about a recent study that whole grains will help you live better longer.
Yes, it's a great study.
Brand new. Yeah. There's so much evidence about how important healthy whole grains are. Nothing negative in the real literature.
Well, two people wrote terrible books. I mean, and I don't need to mention the names about this gluten and grain issue. If an undergraduate student turned in a paper of this quality, they would fail my class. But one of the books went into great detail about the problems with wheat and grains and all this kind of stuff, talking about how bad they are because they're hybridized. And I laughed so hard, and my father, who was a hobby horticulturist and then took classes at Ohio State after he retired, I showed him this, and we both roared. Because if you were to go to the grocery store tomorrow and try to buy something that wasn't hybridized, there's nothing to eat, okay? And had the potato famine in Ireland never would have happened if they'd been hybridizing the potatoes, because there would have been blight with one type and everybody else would have eaten the other types and it would have been fine. So what hybrid is that this person who wrote a terrible book that was poorly referenced, if you want to even call what he did referencing, started this whole myth that the hybridization of wheat is responsible for all of our health issues. And if you know anything about how farming was traditionally done, with seed sharing and hybridization and the whole 9 yards, it's just laugh out loud funny. The problem is most people don't know it, and it's not funny, the misconceptions and the misperceptions that resulted from a terrible book.
Let's do one more round with this. I was under the impression that there were ancient grains like quinoa, millet, amaranth, and teff that weren't hybridized, and that wheat, barley, and oats were. So specifically, one more time, just about wheat, barley, and oats. Again, your thoughts on wheat, barley, and oats, just those three.
When we look at the agricultural science, if we're going to talk about science, the closest thing we have to the primal or primitive wheats are spelt and kamut. Spelt now is about 12, 13%, maybe 14% protein. The average wheat that we have that's organic is 3, 4, 5, 6% protein. The agricultural anthropologists tell us the original wheats that they found, I don't know if it was in petrification or in some other form, were probably 36% or more protein. So seemingly, it's clear that this is not the same as the original wheats. Now, what that does or doesn't do to us, I don't know. I know that gluten is the highest protein within, it's the 80-some% protein in wheat, And the original wheats had about 14% to 17%. That we do know to be a fact. All I know is that when we work with people with celiac disease, and we do a lot of psychotherapy with everyone that comes to us too, that when we remove it from their diet, we see shocking changes. And our medical team sees the inflammatory markers drop dramatically.
Yeah, that's a big difference than what I'm talking about. Celiac disease is that's a real disease. I'm just talking about gluten sensitivity but celiac, no, I totally agree.
Well, isn't celiac disease the most advanced form of gluten intolerance?
Well, yes, it is, but that's like saying when we take children who go into anaphylactic shock off of peanuts, when they go into shock eating peanuts, that they're better off, and they are. But that doesn't mean I can't eat peanuts. Right. I mean, this is a very specific population. The confusion is over the hybridization issue and the fact that a celiac patient is different from a person who doesn't have celiac disease, who is different from a person who has gluten sensitivity. And so another thing, and again, I'm going to go back to, we have to sell this to people, all right? We have got to get people to do this if we're going to make any progress. When you go out with the strictest interpretation of the diet that you possibly can, every layer of restriction, you make it harder for people to do. And the landscape is littered with people who did 21 days of this and 28 days of that, and anybody can do 21 days of perfection. And what they do it with is the one tool that doesn't work in the long term, and that's willpower. Any of you who've studied the science of change know that 100% of all studies have shown willpower has nothing to do with long-term change. Willpower is what causes somebody to be able to do 3 or 4 weeks of perfection. That's why it all goes away, because willpower won't work. So my point is that we need to restrict where restriction is needed. I'm not shy about that. And I'm not shy about telling people they should eat a vegan diet sometimes. I'm just saying that this one size fits all, everybody does every single thing. I think it works against us, and even if we can get people to do it, it works against us in long-term compliance, which is what we have to have. Because here's the deal, if everybody gives up everything for 4 weeks and goes back to what they were doing before, we're sitting here with no progress once more.
It's only about 1% of the population maximum that actually has celiac disease, which is a horrible autoimmune disease, and you will literally degrade your body if you consume it, and it leads to increased risk for cancer and all sorts of things if you're eating gluten, if you have celiac disease. But 1% of the population does not apply to the entire population, and it is very restrictive, and a lot of people, they're overwhelmed with the idea of cutting out meat and dairy and chicken and eggs, which I think they should cut out, and then adding to the mix, making sure everything's organic and making sure everything is gluten-free. It's overwhelming for a lot of people, and it's unnecessarily overwhelming. Stick to the whole grain gluten if you're fine and not sensitive to it, but there's nothing harmful if you're not.
I just want to say one more thing, and that is that to the extent that most people in this country eat so much more protein than they need, I think it is a wonderful advancement for mankind that wheat contains 3% protein instead of 14.
Yeah. I test patients, so they come in and I will get antibody. Do they have an antibody to gluten, to gliadin? And I will biopsy the inside of their intestine, and do they have inflammatory cells in there? And I will test their inflammatory mediators after a meal. And if they don't have these things, they're not having an inflammatory response. You could measure inflammation fairly well. And what I found is if I could switch people, the thing about grains I find so good, I love fruits and vegetables, and if we ate only fruits and vegetables, I think that would be fantastic. The problem is people get really, really hungry. I find that grains is a great way to keep people full. That's my big battle, because I'm dealing with people, like I told you before, it's a biological genetic hunger that they have, and evolutionary, and I need to deal with keeping them full, and I'm not going to be able to keep them full just on fruits and vegetables. And so grains are an absolute vital part of my diet plan.
And we serve grains at the Institute, and especially amaranth, teff, and millet, quinoa. The thing is, the reason that that we are hungry is very much because main food that we eat is cooked and processed. So it all is about how we process those grains. So grains are great, yes. Antioxidants, phytochemicals, helps us with disease, anti-aging and everything. But it's the way that we process it. And if we could teach people, like the Essenes knew hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that if you could germinate seeds, nuts, grains, beans, you get so much more out of the food. And we're living in a time where we don't have quantity. We need quality now. And so I think what we need to teach people is, when I'm hungry, why don't I take a handful of almonds or a handful of walnuts and I make some nut milk. I can make it so easy myself at home, and I don't have to have any preservatives and chemicals and food colors and taste, things in it. So I think grains are good, but it really is how we process them. Did we have just white flour that we made bread from? No. We wanted the whole grain, and if we could germinate it, we absolutely are top-notch.
And I totally agree with that. Like, without a doubt, these grains that you're talking about, I really like their nutritional value, and I think germinating them and sprouting them has clearly been shown to be better. The other thing we need to talk about, though, is the deception that you will get as to what a whole grain is. It has to say on the ingredients whole wheat or whole. It can't say 100% whole. It can't say the thing they'll get you on is multigrain. Like, if you see something that says multigrain, be careful, because that doesn't mean it's a whole grain. It could be multi grains. There might be a whole bunch of different grains, but none of them are whole. And the problem is, remember I showed you that slide earlier today, that the more that you start processing the grain, the more insulin response you're going to have to it, the more you're going to get hungrier later because your blood sugar is going to go up and then go down faster, and you're losing a lot of the vitamin and nutrients. So be careful. We tell you that wheat's good, and then you run out and buy wheat flour that's not whole grain, and then you're going to be in trouble. You're not getting anything good.
That's like just ignore everything on the label except for the ingredients. Like, everything else is all marketing.
I think one other thing, along with the confusion about grains sometimes, is that people think that making muffins and pastries from whole grains makes those better. You know, muffins are treats, and we have very strict rules in our eating plan for this too. You have cookies and muffins on your birthday and holidays, that sort of thing. Day to day, it's the daily fare. And so I think this is another area where vegans can get in trouble sometimes, is thinking, I'm eating vegan whole grain muffins, and I'm eating vegan whole grain crackers, and I'm eating vegan whole grain this and that. And we're still avoiding what we really want to do, which is move people to a diet comprised of whole foods and saving even minimally processed foods. Like, it's one thing to eat a high fiber whole grain cereal, but there's no way you can make the muffin be anything other than a treat. I mean, there's just no way you can do that. And so those are treats. That's for a holiday.
Maybe applesauce and grain.
Well, but you're still talking about a processed food. I mean, it's flour and it's
applesauce
sugar and
muffins are
it's So and the other thing too is, when we're giving dietary directions, we try to use what we call prescriptive communication. The more clear the rules are, the easier it is to follow. And so when we start talking about, if you're going to make muffins, don't have them too often, and use applesauce, and I mean, that's all great, but it doesn't really tell people what to do. It almost is like that moderation message, which we know is completely ineffectual. Yeah. What moderation, by the way, is a great new study out about 2 months ago. These researchers looked into what do people think moderation is. Here's what they concluded. Moderation, in the eyes of the consumer, is how much of something that I really like I want to eat. Yeah. I mean, that's what basically it came down to. Right. If you ask them, what's your idea of moderation with chocolate? If you're a chocolate lover, it's a big amount. If you ask, what do you think the definition of moderation for something somebody else is eating that you don't like so much? It's a tiny amount. So, it's such a subjective thing, and I think it's good to stay away from that kind of thing.
It's funny, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but we keep talking about moderation versus, and I gave a talk yesterday where we were talking about how do you change behaviors. And so a lot of what I do with a patient is tailored to what I see. I see the 6'5" cowboy hat and, belt buckle, and I'm like, okay, I got to be moderate with this guy. But and I said this yesterday, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there seems to me, when I'm really working with someone, and there's just someone extreme, someone that would really wants to change their life, that would be great in an Hippocrates setting, that wants to sprout their beans and wants to do all that stuff. I tend to find in these people that maybe extreme is really good. I tend to find, look, in the end, if you go extreme, that's when you really get benefits, is when you really follow everything. And I tend to find that I said this yesterday, 99% effort is hard, 100% effort is easy. Because at 99%, like for instance, I did love cheese pizzas. I loved them. And so when I was vegetarian, I wasn't that much healthier because I could eat a cheese pizza. So I would eat cheese pizzas a lot because, yeah, I could eat that. Yeah, I ate it yesterday, but here it is, so I could eat it. But as soon as I said, no more cheese pizza, and there's a line in the sand, then there's just no thought process. There's no more cheese pizza. So there is something about, on a global scale, if we're going out to America and we're trying to change this unbelievably ridiculous eating society, we have to be a little bit moderate in our message. But you as an individual, if you're going to make changes, man, put the chips in, go all in. Listen to what these people are like. Sprout your beans. I'll do anything I can. Because the more healthy I get, the more better I feel, and I'm addicted to this, so I want to be as healthy as possible. So you do have to kind of temper that message.
So let's go one more round, just so we're super clear. I'm forgetting about what is easy to get patients to do or what we can get compliance. For people that just want to know flat out, if they go to Whole Foods Market or anywhere in place, and there's a big bin, and there's all the nuts and seeds and grains, and and they're going to cook it in the wheat berries or the barley or the oats. Are these healthful foods? Should they be eating them? What are we saying? We're saying they're not as good as quinoa, but they're still very good. Like, in terms of a person who wants to eat wheat, barley, and oats as a regular part of their diet, are we saying that these are, reasonably healthful things, just not as ideal as teff? Or are we saying that they're actually, for a non-celiac person, what are we saying? One more time.
Well, it depends upon the individual. If it's a person coming from the Western diet, and this is a new introduction to them, it's so much better than what they've done. The answer is absolutely. They should eat all of that. They should avoid the roasted nuts there.
We're not doing nuts yet, just the grains.
Okay, the grains. And the reality is, next to the bin where the oats and the rye is teff and quinoa and amaranth, the same bins. So maybe it's the educational process. So we have to say to them, for instance, I tell people they all love oatmeal. Oatmeal sort of popular worldwide. I say, have you ever tasted teff? Tastes just like oatmeal, but it doesn't have the acidity that the oatmeal has, etc. And most of the people that I've worked with come back and say, boy, that's delicious. It's actually sweeter. Now, not everyone's going to do it. So would it be better to have a whole oat than it would be the bacon they used to eat? You bet.
So, yeah, and you want superior nutrition. So you have to go organic, because the way that we cultivate grains when it's not organic is you don't get the nutrition that you're looking for. So the first thing is go for organic grains when you shop next time.
I'll just respectfully disagree with that for a couple of reasons. In addition to getting people to listen to us, we have to get them to be able to afford it. And buying organic food is out of the realm of possibility for a lot of the people who are coming to us for advice. I also would point out the research, Dr. Esselstyn has 31-year data on his patients. Dr. McDougall published a study with 1,700 of his patients. Swank followed his patients for 34 years. Barnard's published his studies. Time and time again, no requirement to eat organic food. Now, I buy it whenever I can. My circumstances allow me to do it. Availability and cost are an issue, but really the studies have not shown that you have to eat organic food in order to accomplish the health improvement that we're looking for, reverse type 2 diabetes, reverse heart disease, that sort of thing.
I've worked in food deserts. I've set up programs for people in environments where they don't have access to anything but McDonald's and KFC and all that. And to tell them they have to find something, a more super green is not going to be feasible, and it's not going to be attractive. And I worked with a lot of people also in different populations that travel a lot and are in hotels and around in small towns around America and out of the country. And for the vast majority of people, oatmeal is readily available, and it's a wonderful food. Anything that they could find that's going to help support them, I want them to do that. So I'd rather people see the accessibility, see it as affordable, because that's another huge myth about plant-based diets, that they're not affordable, and making it as accessible as you can is ideal. And also there's a great study about organic. I forget who actually published it, but it was looking at the Dirty Dozen, and they compared cancer, increased risk of cancer versus cancer from the pesticides versus cancer from not eating them. One serving of fruit and one serving of vegetable extra a day can prevent 20,000 cases of cancer a year versus I think it was 10 cases of toxicity from the pesticides. So the overarching message in all the information, all the studies you cited and on and on and on is it's more important that you eat more fruits and vegetables and not worry about it being organic necessarily. Yes, it's better, but it's not always available.
Yeah, so personally, I only buy organic. I can't eat, just the concept of the way we farm and stuff now bothers the hell out of me, both what we're doing to the soil and what's on that food. But back to science. Stanford study took organic versus non-organic, tested everything you could in the lab. It had the same nutritional value, whether it came from organic, not organic. Now, the non-organic did have more pesticides. And so who wants to eat pesticides? But, Dr. Greger was saying it on that movie yesterday that we were watching. Our patients are coming, look, when you look at you should spend a day with me in clinic and look at the food logs, because we're all healthy, we're worried, is it GMO, is it organic, is it teff, or is it oats? And my patients, or is it McDonald's, or is it Burger King? And so, I just want my patients to freaking stop eating that stuff. And if I tell them that, this kind of crazy stuff and they don't even know. I mean, seriously, when I say quinoa, they look at me like, what the hell is quinoa? and so I just have to temper it. And so I've got to do what's available. Now, in an ideal world, you should be able to pull into 7-Eleven and get some teff and some grains and eat it up, and that would be fantastic. And we need to, in some world, we need to move towards that. And so I hate to say just eat the lesser. The other thing I don't like too is the food calculus. Like, you only need to eat superfoods all the time, and this superfood is better than that superfood, so eat this all the time. I just don't think that's necessarily out there. So I do often. I think oatmeal is like my biggest go-to meal for my patients.
I just want to add one thing. We purists up here had dinner together before with all that not organic food from the cafe.
Yes.
And we still survived. We're here to talk to you. And the reason I'm saying that, it just goes to show you, everybody here at this table is ridiculously conscious of their health. We all are. And we care deeply about what happens to other people and their health. We are here at a resort, and we had, I don't know about the rest of you, we had 60 minutes to eat, so we went in the cafe, we made the best of the options, which was the salad bar, and the fruit bowl, and that's the way it goes. We're all doing the best we can. So I think that we have to be careful we don't advise other people to adhere to rules that we can't even adhere to. We can't always eat organic. We couldn't do it today, and I've been eating the salad bar since Wednesday. I'm still alive.
Yeah.
And I was going to say one other thing too, and I can't remember what it was, but it was
I can't stand the thing though. The pesticides and the farming still bother me though. I'm bothered by the studies that show that lactating females will have pesticides in there. I don't know. At one point, I want to make it easy on patients. On another point, I want to be an activist and say we need to do something against it. And so it leaves me split. Yeah, it is. Organic farming is growing, and local farming is growing. But what I'd really like to see, well, you guys saw that slide I put up earlier today, where the USDA tells us this is what we should eat, and then the funding is completely different, and that's what we got to change. Local farmers need to get some better food.
To make some comments, Uncle Ben's Rice now has a quinoa mix that you can get in the poorest places in the United States. When I go in there to teach, this is something I point to. I made a conscious decision a number of decades ago not to eat anything but organic food. So I got in the car and drove 7 minutes away from here, and I got organic food and organic juice today. But every one of us have, and I'm not saying it's always practical for people, because when I had a private practice like some of these people have up here, it was almost impossible. It was like I was a Martian talking to people and saying to people, hey, you've got to eat raw food. They thought raw food was like uncooked meat. So I sympathize. I sympathize with what you're saying. I think we also, when we look at the science, what is very clear and there's abundant amount of this, is that pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides harm the DNA and RNA structure. So you may not be the person who suffers eminently from your consumption, long-term bioaccumulation consumption of that, but your offspring does, and we're seeing that now. We don't have to wait another generation for this. We're already seeing this. And so I think, I always have a hard time because I get up in the morning reading science, go to bed and do it 7 days a week. Science is cherry-picked. Who funds the studies are pretty much people that have vested interest. We looked at, my colleagues that I go on lecture tours around the world, Esselstyn, Campbell, et cetera. We got, for instance, the Minister of the EU's Health to get on a plant-based diet and basically help us put the first lifestyle medical school together, opened just this month in Europe. And all of these men are telling me when we're spending weeks together traveling that they have to be very, very simple in what they approach, and they have to look at one thing. Like, if all I did is work with heart disease and diabetes, I would have quit years ago, because it's boring. If you get on a plant-based diet, I don't care if it's organic or not organic, everyone's going to get better. I don't see type 2 diabetics not get better on plant-based diets, unless they eat the kind of plant-based diet I started on, a vegan junk food diet. And a vegan junk food diet, and so this is what you also stated, that when we looked at long-term study, other than the Oxford study, that had some platitudes of intelligence in it, we basically saw that they were looking at people who were moral vegans versus health vegans. Most vegans are on junk food diets as far as I'm concerned, because once you cook a food, we know from the Dr. Williams' work and the work we've done for 6 decades, pretty much all the phytochemicals are gone. The vitamins are altered, so you're starving at some level. On a weekly basis, 52 weeks a year since 1956, when guests come in from the Western diet, because not everyone's on a vegan diet when they come to us, actually it's only about 32% have been eating a vegan diet for a minimum of 3 months. We have some long-term, that's 7% of the people that come to us. So they're coming from Western diets to us, and one common thing we hear by the 3rd or 4th day, we're not hungry. Because it's not about caloric intake and familiarity, it's about nourishment. And getting the nourishment in the body, all at once you're not hungry. I mean, I used to eat from morning to night as a vegan. Why? Because I wasn't being nourished.
A couple of things. First of all, it is about caloric intake. We have to have calorically adequate diets, and the landscape is littered with people who tried to eat fruits and vegetables and wanted to chew their arm off and eat their desk, and so went back to eating chicken because of that. And so I think we have the raw food diet has a lot of limitations, one of which is that I know it works out for some people, but for the vast majority of people, it doesn't work out. I think the second point that needs to be made is that the reason why the population is getting sicker is not because of cooked food. I mean, the 69% of calories in the Okinawan diet come from sweet potatoes. They're cooking the sweet potatoes. 90% of the Papua New Guinean diet comes from sweet potatoes. They're cooking the sweet potatoes. The rural Chinese are eating cooked food. The Northern Africans are eating cooked food. And I think it's great to eat a lot of raw food. I eat as many raw fruits and vegetables as I can. But I think it would be disingenuous to tell people that if they're eating cooked food that it's not possible for them to be nourished. Now, having said that, I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, we have a colleague who does water-only fasting, no food. And it's a good idea under medical supervision for a period of time. Juicing diets are great for a period of time, but we're trying to get people to do this in their own environment. And we're also trying to stay clear on the science, because it's unfortunate if somebody would come to me and say, I know you said I had to eat raw food, but what's happening with all these other populations who don't do that and they're healthy? I don't know how to explain that.
Well, I'll explain it to you, because we've been doing a study, clinical research on humans, 600,000 to be exact, since 1956. It's never
Can I just ask where you published it? Because I'd like to read it.
We don't publish things because we're under constant scrutiny. I write books for people who are interested in science. And if you're interested, you can read the books. So maybe you don't understand that the same grain that you cook and create acrylamides in and kill the phytochemicals in, these are not opinions, these are scientific facts. Look at the work of the Linus Pauling Institute, Dr. David Williams, one of the many speakers I have come to the Institute, and speak in our series, show you that the medicine in the food is gone when you cook it. The original work on acrylamides were done 28 years ago in Sweden, and now in 17 countries, and the Germans did a pretty good job, but the Italians did the best. Acrylamides are carcinogens once you cook a whole, even an organic grain. Now, I'm not suggesting that what I'm talking about's familiar to everyone or easy to explain to the lay public. There's a difference between approaching getting more people to go on a vegan diet and really understanding the science and not condemning something you don't understand.
You know, I don't want to, we can't, everything has to be published using scientific method, and if it isn't, I don't believe it. And I'll tell you this, that is not foolish, that's science. We're never getting advances of people say, I'm not going to publish my data,
you tell me
I'm going to write a book.
Could you tell me what the word science means to you?
Yeah, science means that we are going to take a study, we are going to make sure that study is replicated, that it's reviewed, that it uses scientific method with scientific analysis. Now there's over a million publications a year and only about 5 or 10 that really mean anything. So you have to sit there and have analytical minds to be able to do it. But to say, I don't publish, just tells me that it's not science. You don't publish because you're scared of getting peer review. Now, I'll tell you this, absolutely, positively, listen to me, you do not get acrylamides when you grill vegetables. It's been studied a million times, scientific studies, sorry, in journals. Grill up your vegetables all you want. I do agree with you that certain vegetables you will lose some nutrient values. Certain vegetables get more values when you cook them. It is much more nutritious to eat cooked spinach. It's much more nutritious to eat a cooked tomato. This is scientific fact. And we can make, I hear all this BS, like someone brought up the other day, like the blood type diet. This stuff is crap. There's science, people, and the thing that gets the vegan diet is when we go away from science. You have got to be scientific. You have to have scientific method, it has to be replicated, and it has to be proven before it's going to be accepted by a widespread doctors group. Eat your grilled vegetables, they're totally, completely nutritious for you.
So what you're suggesting is that the science that you like to read and agree with
It's
is the only...
It's the science that's out
Stop.
there, not that I
Stop.
want to read.
Listen, I listen to you. What you're suggesting is that science you cherry pick and choose to read is the only real good science.
Absolutely.
That's the science I just mentioned is not good science.
It's not science if it's not printed. If it's not reviewed.
Let's go back, and maybe you didn't listen. Maybe it went in one ear and out the other.
Don't say it's printed in your book,
Do you know
because
who?
that doesn't matter to me.
Every one of my books has validation of science.
It's not
Every one of
validated
my-
science
listen.
unless it's reviewed in a peer review group where we look at the methodology, we look at the statistics, and we see if you did an accurate study.
When
What's your
you're
end?
done,
Did you use a
when you're done,
multivariate
I'll
regression?
explain what my books reflect. When you're done. Every one of my books reflect science that I get out of scientific journals, peer review scientific journals. Now, you asked me specifically, have we done science? The answer is no. We don't have a research team, statisticians, nor do we politically choose to do that. Have we invited people in? I'm right now in discussion with Harvard University. They want to come and do long-term studies.
Talk about Harvard, yeah.
Okay. Number two, I mentioned two people. Have you ever read Dr. David Williams, Linus Pauling Institute?
I know who Dr. Dave
Okay.
Williams is.
Do you know? Have you read his work?
He has no, what
I'm
published
asking
study?
a question.
No,
Have
I've not
you
read,
read his
I've not
work?
read a published paper, and I've
That's
read the
all he
literature.
does is publish papers. He's
Show
a
me the paper
scientist.
that
He's a
shows that there's
PhD.
just show me the paper that shows there's acrylamides and heterocyclic amines when you cook vegetables. That's all I ask. Just show me that paper.
I'll show you those papers, and I'll show you from 17 countries. I'll repeat that again.
Okay.
The most important in my books, Food is Medicine, peer-reviewed science. Out of Italy, the most important. Germany, my wife's country is Sweden, is where it came out of. Their top scientific institution there.
Show me the study.
Okay.
Right.
Now, what you're saying,
Because
before
in
you
my
start,
book, there's a
what you're
reference right
saying-
now, if we could
what
get
you're
it, and I'll
saying
show you the
is if
reference
I
as
show
well.
you the studies with that proof, you're going to instantly change your mind?
I will, yeah, if it proves it.
Oh, good. Well, I don't change my
If
mind
you show me
that
it
quick.
shows acrylamides and I read the study and I look at
I
the
don't
methods.
change my mind that quick.
No, I do.
I look at long-term studies and over periods of time, and then I practice this with people.
I want to just insert one thing, and scientific debate is important. And the one thing I want to add to this is that the fact that it's published doesn't necessarily make it right.
Without a
okay?
doubt.
And I'll tell you what I mean by that. We took, and I don't care about mentioning names anymore, when we took that idiot book Wheat Belly by William Davis,
Yeah.
all right? I had an intern in my office pull up every study that he referenced, and we were able to pull up every single one of them except for 3. So we got 3 to the extent that he referenced. And then we looked at, we had the intern sit there, and I reviewed the work at the end. We reviewed the reference statement, the reference with the statement to see if it was correct. All right, so he's writing a book about why everybody should not eat wheat. He's got references. It's very deceptive because we did word searches on the studies once we downloaded them to our server. Several times he said that this study shows that wheat's bad for you. Only we couldn't find the word wheat in the text of the study anywhere. It's not a study about wheat.
Right.
So the point that I'm making is that there are levels of scientific validation that we have to consider. And the fact that somebody can produce a study, says here's a study that says this. First of all, does the study say this? Second thing, methodological errors. What was the end? I mean, then you have to look at, is this a good study?
Yeah,
Okay.
like one of the best books out there, or one of the best books, one of the most popular books out there is Good Calorie, Bad Calorie by Gary Taubes. Some of the people that he references, the authors, is like, that's not what I meant. They took them absolutely, completely out of context. But there's good science and bad science. And when I go to scientific, where there's a room like this and it's all scientists, we have these debates and we yell at each other. But we're debating science. We're like, well, you took 50 people, but you didn't do a student t-test. Instead, you did an Anacova test and this complicated statistics. So we're going into what was your scientific method and where is bias that would support a conclusion. Now, when I look at a paper, like if you bring me a paper, I'm not looking at the conclusion. I'm looking at your methods. I'm looking at what statistical analysis you did. I'm looking at, is your N powered enough in order to give me an answer? So there's definitely good science and there's bad science. But to me, good science and bad science is a lot better than no science. You can't, no one could, if someone just says, hey, I saw 50 people and they all did really well eating X, and therefore X is good for you, that means nothing to me. I need to know how you followed those 50 people. How are you evaluating them? Could there be confounding factors? Maybe X did better because they were also doing Y, you just didn't measure Y. And that's what science is trying to piece through all of this in order to get an answer. And science is going to change. Like what we're telling you right now could change next week. Science can absolutely change, and my opinions have changed. I wrote a frickin' book that told people to eat tons of meat. And so science can definitely change over the time. And it's not, we're arguing, but we're arguing on, we're arguing minutia. I mean, by the long and short of it, if I could send every patient I have over to Hippocrates, I would. And so understand that while we argue as doctors about this stuff, we agree on the vast majority of stuff. It's just the minutia that we're getting at.
I agree with that. God bless you.
Yeah. I mean, we love each other. Scientists like to argue. And it's sad because scientists, we like to argue. You should see, we get you go to a surgery meeting and the egos get flared and we get some contentious fighting, although we all somewhat agree. The problem is when you guys watch us argue, it makes you confused, but don't get confused about the fact that we all agree on the basics of this idea.
Hold on. Okay. What about nuts?
You mean us or the ones you eat? The only two nuts we don't like people to eat are cashews and peanuts. All the other nuts are good, and talk about science, almost every month they come out with great reasons to eat nuts.
And also just qualify if you're talking about raw, roasted, salted, what form do they have to be in?
Raw.
Yeah, obviously raw. And nuts really fills you up. They're chewy, they are really great food, great protein, great minerals, and essential fats, of course, and they fill you up and they give you good nourishment. So they're a great snack. Instead of a chocolate bar, you get a handful of nuts.
What I tell people about nuts, again, general population coming into our place, 2/3 of the people are overweight or obese, and so we have to have adequate calorie density, and that's why the inclusion of grains and starches. But you also have to deal with too much calorie density in the diet when people show up. So when we get the oils out of the diet, and when we relegate foods like avocados and nuts and those types of things to when they appear in a dish. Okay, so if I go get a black bean wrap at a restaurant and it has some avocado in it, that's great. But when I buy a bag full of avocados and I go home and I start putting them in my food, when I buy a bag of cashews or a bag of almonds, let's take a nut we would all agree on is okay, bag of almonds, and I'm taking a handful of almonds, it's very difficult for people to stay lean and keep their fat intake down when they're eating almonds, and so if again prescriptive communication, use these in dishes. Don't put your hand in the bag, and eat hands full of them. And some of you know Chef AJ's story. Hung on to the eating nuts, said nuts are healthy. I eat nuts every day. She carried 35 extra pounds, gave up the nuts. The weight and finally, Dr. Lyle at True North is the one who said, AJ, you got a math problem. Okay, let me show you the calorie density of those nuts that you're eating every day. And as soon as they came out of the diet, you've seen that. If you can go online tonight, look up Chef AJ, look at the before and after pictures. They're all over the internet. And the only thing she changed was the nuts.
Okay, there is an abundance. First of all, a nut comes naturally in a big package that's really hard to get at. And so if you really think about how much nuts we're supposed to consume, it takes a lot of work to get to one nut. We never had bags of nuts where you could just literally do this. And I know personally, I've worked with AJ a lot over the years, watched this whole evolution occur, and she says it's because she's addicted to nuts and she couldn't stop. Now, the overwhelming evidence in the data shows that nuts are health promoting. They decrease risk for type 2 diabetes, for heart disease, for obesity. But all of those studies, the consensus seems to be between 1 to 2 ounces or 30 to 60 grams a day, which is a small dose. And again, if you were cracking that open, that would be easy to do. But AJ and other people find themselves as way too easy. You have those nuts out, my kids too. You know, it's an easy mouth to hand, but very nutritionally dense. They have wonderful things like phytosterols and vitamin E and all these wonderful nutrients that we need, and we could get almost exclusively some of them from nuts and seeds. So I do recommend them. I think they're wonderful. Moderation, but really 1 to 2 tablespoons, 1 to 2 ounces a day is the optimal in the research.
All right, so peanuts aren't really a nut, right? They're a legume. And they have higher saturated fat. Walnuts are much higher in omega-3, so I like that. There was a study done. Now, okay, back to biases, because everything is freaking biased. But the study was funded by the almond company. And so take it with a grain of almond. But they gave people 500 extra calories a day of almonds. And then they looked at their weight. They didn't gain weight. And I don't know why. 500 extra calories, you would think they would. But, okay, that aside, they didn't gain weight. But I worry in my patients because my patients are Chef AJ, and there's a guy named Josh Lajani. You guys should meet Josh. Josh was 450 pounds. Now he is one of the top ultra marathoners, and he's really thin, and I went running with him. And this girl we know makes these nut bars, and they're totally organic, and she just binds the nuts together, and it's basically you're just eating nuts in a bar. And I said, God, these are so good, you should try one. He said, I'm not gonna even try it. And I was like, why? He's like, I just know I can't say no. And so you got to know yourself. If you know you can't say no and you're going to overeat it, and I know because I love pistachios. I mean, I go crazy over pistachios, but you have to freaking work like crazy, like she was saying, to get those pistachios. Now they've got pistachios in a bag where you just scoop it up. I do think calorie density probably will eventually play a role, but I do think nuts are extremely healthy. You just got to know who you are. Are you an ectomorphic body that can eat anything and not get fat? Great. If you're struggling to lose weight, be careful. Although I do tell my patients to eat nuts.
Well, apparently, like the fiber in there helps it not, all of the calories are not absorbed. So there's a lot of reasons metabolically that they don't, they are still calorically dense, of course, and it depends on who you are.
Now we know the pistachios are loaded with glutathione, and I never knew I liked them so much, but it must be your body's crying out for them.
For glutathione. And glutathione's a powerful thing for hypertension and stuff. So, yeah.
In the United States, due to the Kodak's international ruling, they're now irradiating most of the nuts. So if you see raw nuts that are American, most likely it's a lie. I saw Whole Food was lying on that until recently, and somebody busted them. And so for about 3 to 5 years now, most of the nuts in America, American nuts sold in America. We can ship raw nuts to Canada and everywhere else. But our raw nuts from California, which I have a bias, they are the best in the world. California almonds are just delicious. You either have to get them underground, or as we have to at the Institute, get them from Italy sometimes, ironically.
Are you just talking about almonds? The other nuts
Almonds.
are not
See, the
irradiated?
other ones they haven't messed with yet.
Okay. Yeah, when I go to Whole Foods, they say raw unpasteurized almonds, so I think those are the ones that are still raw, or they say Italian almonds, which means, okay. What about seeds, sunflower, sesame, flax, chia, hemp, pumpkin?
Other than the exotic ones like chia, I think these are actually better and more universal. So when I was over in India and Egypt and in Calcutta, India, I didn't tell them about almonds or anything. I told them about seeds they could get, and for pennies worldwide. And these are just as nourishing and, frankly, I think easier to digest for most people.
Yeah, like most all over the world, we use sesame seed and sunflower seed and pumpkin seed. And, I think these are amazing foods. And we make sauces out of them, soups out of them. We make, just anything. These are great. You can make milks for your kids out of them. And, of course, we like to soak them and sprout them so that they're so much more nutritious and easier to metabolize too, because the carb is broken down to simple sugar, fat to fatty acids, and protein to amino acids. So it's so much easier for your child, especially, to digest this.
I think that seeds are fine and good to include in the diet, and you don't see this likelihood of people over consuming them. You grind up some flax and put it in a smoothie or sprinkle it on oatmeal. I mean, people just don't overeat them the way they do almonds and walnuts and Brazil nuts and that sort of thing. So it's much safer food for people who tend to eat too much of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. They're nutritional nuggets. They're easier to not overeat on, and they're great culinarily. Like, you can make a great flax egg or chia egg and transform your baking and omit all those animal products. And they're wonderful sources of omega-3s, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning. And I love seeds. 1 to 2 tablespoons a day is all we need.
Love seeds too, but you have to ground flax seeds, otherwise you won't absorb it, and you have to eat it right away, otherwise it'll oxidize, but otherwise love it.
What about beans?
Beans should always be germinated, as should grains, because they have what we call an enzyme inhibitor, which really historically is amazing. Well before humans were here, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago, through nature and evolution, every seed created a pesticide, a natural pesticide, so that type of seed never perished. So the bugs would never eat the last one, or the animals would never eat the last one. They'd get nauseous. And so these are what we call enzyme inhibitors, making it much more difficult for them. They don't really kill you, but much more difficult for your body to digest them. Once you soak them and germinate them, soaking overnight's not enough. Most grains take 2 days to germinate. Most beans take 2 days, with the exception of the ones that should be 5 days, like mung bean sprouts, which are traditional food in all the Asian cuisine. Why? Because they're amazing. They're loaded with zinc. So if you have premature graying of your hair, balding, they're loaded with zinc. So if you have breast problems or prostate problems, immune system problems, and it's a really, really inexpensive way to eat these foods.
So beans, you have 100 trillion cells in your body, and there's constant communication. And beans, especially sprouted, of course, it's easier to digest, but beans are great to help the communication of your cells. So they're an immune booster. They're fantastic.
And they're part of the calorie density. They can provide calorie density in a diet that has a lot of fruits and vegetables. You need that underlying calorie density. So recommend them heartily.
Love legumes. They are a wonderful source of lysine, which can fall short in a plant-based diet. Of all the amino acids, that's the one that you really need to kind of think about. Not really. You just need to have legumes. So I recommend about 1.5 servings a day. 3 servings a day. So about 1.5 cups a day. All kinds of beans, lentils, any variety. Really, really wonderful staple. Great for versatility. Great for satiety. Excellent source of different types of fibers that we really need. The viscous fibers and all that.
Yeah, when I was doing all my research on the more I got into research and looking at, the one thing that came over and over when we're talking about traditional diets, like if you look at the blue zones, in Okinawa it's soybean, in Sardinia it's white beans and fava beans, in the Nicoya Peninsula it's black beans. Everywhere it's beans, and legumes are one of the absolutely best diets for longevity That's been shown in so many. You can't find a study where beans are bad for you, but here's the funny thing, is that if you talk to a paleo person, they act like beans are absolute poison. And you'd think my biggest problem with the paleo people would be their meat consumption, and for me it's really the fact that they won't eat beans. I just can't, I cannot fathom that they are so dogmatic that they can't eat a bean, because to me it's one of the healthiest foods you can eat.
Yeah, it's the one food that all the blue zones have in common.
Yeah, they all have it in common.
Can't leave the subject without talking about it. It does create something in most of us in our gastrointestinal tract.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's the highest roughage food that people eat.
Actually, you might be able to answer this, because this is a big problem I have with my patients. I want them to eat legumes. I know if you sprout it, you don't seem to have as much gas.
From 17 to, depending upon the bean, 17 to 57 times more digestible.
Yeah, so what I usually tell my patients is about getting sprouted beans or sprouting them themselves. What about baking soda in the sprouting process, or soaking beans with baking soda? Because that's been something
Baking
that's
soda
helped.
will semi-alkalize it. I'm not sure, frankly, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a old wives' tale, but it seems to work with my patients that if you soak
Kombu
it.
too. Kombu.
Oh yeah, and kombu
the
too.
sea
Yeah,
vegetable,
kombu
you could
also.
soak it.
Is if you soak with it, it tends to take away the alpha carbonose, which is what the bacteria eat in order to cause gas. But now what I tell patients is, because I eat beans all the time, so I can eat like the biggest thing of beans. It doesn't touch me. But that wasn't the case when I first started eating beans, and I almost quit when I first started.
But see, I see
Your
that a
wife
lot
almost
too.
quit.
She did, but although, well, we don't need to get into but although if you're on a plant-based diet, it doesn't, anyway.
Well, but what I think what happens
You were
is
both on the diet?
Yeah, well, if you're on your plant-based diet, it's not, there's no, actually the odors in stuff come from the sulfur in the animal food, so you can get away with
Exactly.
it without
But
causing
people
a
are going
problem.
from eating a very low fiber diet and all of a sudden eating a high
know,
fiber
yeah.
diet, and
That's it.
and beans have a lot of fiber in them, which is a wonderful thing. But it takes getting used to. You have to adapt to it. So I recommend people go up slowly, like add a half a cup, and then consistently have it every single day, because you are literally regrowing an entire different microbiome. Your entire all of the bacteria in your gut, the profiles are changing. You're getting more of the healthy bacteria, and you're killing off the pathogenic bacteria. So that takes time. And if you're consistent and you upward grow up to the 3 servings a day and you stay with it, you're not going to experience it. It's really a transitional thing that I've seen, and it just seems to make sense. And people do get better with consistency.
Think about your intestinal tract, if you eat like I used to eat, as a guy who's never lifted a weight in his life. Now you bring him to the gym. So the digestive tract doesn't function. And you're putting heavy weights. These beans, the roughage, the fiber content, are heavy weights. So it took me 3 years when I look in retrospect. And then people didn't mind walking behind me at that point.
No, it takes some time. What about, do any of you use enzymes with your patients? Have them do enzymes before? Yeah.
Enzymes, digestive enzymes are phenomenal for this. You know, we make a very, very strong variety. And if you have a real problem, you even want to go to protease enzymes.
Yeah. So I do that too. I tell my patients to take digestive enzymes. You could buy cheap ones. I don't know how great the cheap are. The Beano, I don't know. They seem to get moderate results with it, yeah.
Beano works. Beano you can
don't want
get...
to downregulate your own enzymes, your own production of enzymes long term. So it's,
Right.
to get used to it maybe, but to transition them off of that.
Yeah, I do transition them off, but I just, because people get so turned off by the bloating that they're like, this whole diet didn't work for me as soon as they bloat once.
One thing you can do too is, even once somebody's adopted a plant-based diet and they're completely converted over, some people it's a dose-dependent response. Like they'll do okay with a cup of beans, but more than that, it's a problem, or a half a cup. And so they have to somewhat know their own body. And we see this with other foods too. I mean, some people can eat a pound of raw cabbage and it doesn't bother them, and other people, raw cabbage just bloats them up. And so I think there is a little bit of you have to figure out what your body likes a lot of, and make some adjustments accordingly.
What about adding oil to your food?
Somebody that's had a recent coronary problem, heart problem, I would avoid it and make sure you're eating those foods that have the essential fats in it. But I think small amounts of oil, especially to try to make this real for people, is almost essential. It's just the choices of oil. So you don't go to the typical corn and safflower, et cetera. You would try to go to at least olive oil, which is a monounsaturated oil, and then you would go to better than that, flax oil and hemp oil and et cetera.
It depends on how your food is prepared. If everything you have is fried and cooked, that's it's not a good thing to have a lot of oils. If it's a big salad, of course you can spread some cold pressed olive oil or chia or hemp oil on it, and without feeling like, I'm getting too much calories, it's fine. So it's the combination of the food that you choose.
The problem with oils is calorie density. I mean, a tablespoon of oil has 14 grams of fat, 120 calories. I'm 5'7", I weigh 130 pounds. I'm pretty athletic. I own a gym and a yoga studio, so I can pretty much work out whenever I want, freedom of time, the whole 9 yards. So not a lot of room for increasing the exercise and all that sort of thing. But if I were to add to my existing diet right now, 3 tablespoons of an olive oil-based salad dressing a day to my diet, in about a year I'd gain 32 pounds. All right? So we got two-thirds of the country overweight or obese. And so we have to make sure the diet is calorically adequate when we convert them over. But part of where their problem is they're eating so much calorie in the diet that they don't even realize is there. And here's the thing, some people get away with it, like they don't put on weight when they eat oils. But look at the research on the effect of oils on atherosclerotic plaque, heart disease. I mean, David Blankenhorn's studies, Lawrence Riddell's studies of the African green monkeys. If you can stay lean eating this stuff, which I clearly can't because I used to be overweight, you're still building heart disease if you're eating these oils for most people.
My last book, The Vegetarian Diet, I went to town to try to figure out why is the Mediterranean diet so healthy with all of that olive oil? And because I do recommend, for the same reasons, for calorie density, most of the people that come to me for help want or need to lose weight or have problems with their cholesterol levels and all that. So I really dug into all of the olive oil stuff, and it really does look like that the Mediterranean diets are successful in spite of, not because of, the olive oil. So I do recommend not having oil. I don't think it's plausible to go the whole, everywhere all the time and have zero oil. That's really difficult. But if you're really sick, then that's something you need to pay attention to. Ideally, we're all cooking all of our meals. We're eating everything at home, and we have full control. It's very easy to omit oil, culinarily speaking, and baking and cooking and sautéing and dressings. Everything's really easy at home. But when I go out a lot, I travel a lot, it's very hard to find oil-free outside. So it depends on the spectrum of how healthy you are, how much weight you're trying to lose and all that, but it is something to try conscientiously to eliminate as much as possible.
Yeah, it's funny. So you've got this group up here, and we're trying to see if there's consensus. And on oils and nuts, we seem to all be somewhat in consensus. But if Dr. Esselstyn and Campbell were here, they would be going crazy saying absolutely no. Dr. Esselstyn always refers to one article that showed, even with olive oils, that there's endothelial damage. But there's been a lot of studies that show that monounsaturated fat does not seem to lead to heart disease. Actually might be beneficial in heart disease. However, they're comparing it to saturated fat. They're not comparing it to no oil. That's not what they're comparing to, so I think no oil. I sense no oil would do better. My bane of existence, though, is oil, and that's because it's so, my patients, they put it on everything. They think it's good for them, so olive oil is just like, it's like you said, there's healthy properties in olive oil, the catechins and stuff like that, but that's not the reason the Mediterranean diet is healthy. And yet here people are like, oh, the Mediterraneans are great. I'm just gonna, you order your hummus and it comes in a pool of olive oil, which is very calorie dense. And for my patients, the one thing that's been very successful for me is cutting out oil and helping them lose weight. Not that oil in itself is awful. If you're skinny and you want to put a little olive oil on your salad, great. I don't think it's that bad. But for my patients that are really struggling, that have very slow metabolisms, where I'm trying to cut calories, anywhere I could cut calories, oil's the first to go.
Yeah, one of the things that, I was completely adamantly against oil, and we talk about scientific literature, the last 5 years, I'm starting to rethink this whole thing. Because when we look at the brain, and the requirement the brain has, and dementia, and they're looking at groups of people that consume oil versus people who do not, and I don't know the answer. All I know is I think we all should stay very open to this.
Is there a distinction between taking quinoa and a sweet potato and some salad and taking few tablespoons of olive oil and putting it on right out of the pantry versus taking that same oil, putting it on it, and then cooking it in the oven for 20 minutes? So is there a difference between olive oil and olive oil that you cooked in the oven or cooked in the oven? Heat it up?
We would prefer you cook no oil ever. So if you want something that's fatty rather than butter, take the sweet potato out of baking, or even if you steam it, let it sit for a bit so it's not 200 degrees, and then spray oil on. One of the things the Italians, they gave us too much oil in a can that reduced it, called the Misto can, M-I-S-T-O. And you can get this at most home appliance stores. And you can put any oil you have in there and pump it up, and you're going to feel like you've had 20 times the oil, and you're getting probably 1/10 the oil. So if you're going to consume oil, that's a good way to do it. Because you don't want to cook any oil. That destroys the molecular structure and becomes cardiovascular concern, and the list goes on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is, no matter what you've taught about certain like coconut oil that can be heated, no oil should be heated because you do change it. And you know, oils, of course, if I get extra virgin olive oil, that has been cold pressed now, and why would I heat it? That just take all the money. I paid lots of money for this thing. Might as well buy cheaper oil. So, you know, and it does, talking about oil, we are sparingly. We have, the guests can take oils as they want, but we also teach them. You know, it takes 40 pounds of olives to make a quart of olive oil. So, of course, everything is concentrate, and so is nut butter, you know, and all of that. So, you know, those things you take with moderation, but we find, because, of course, our diet is 80% raw and alive, and 20% is plant-based, but cooked, unless you have a serious problem right now, then it's 100%. That it's okay to add that and to add those calories. So to me, it really depends on how I treated the foods that I had.
I think one of the issues is that if somebody is really motivated to watch what they eat and that sort of thing, and I think your population is pretty motivated, which is good. That's one of the reasons why you can be successful with them. I come back to this prescriptive communication and dealing with a population of people who've been eating Burger King or Kentucky Fried Chicken, or the healthier version of it. I made the fried chicken at home because I'm a scratch cook, so that's a whole lot better, right? But the problem, when I said about that study, moderation is the amount of something that I want to eat that I like. So you put the olive oil on the counter and tell people to use it sparingly. You put the cashews in the pantry, don't eat too many of them. And you go through some of the high-risk foods because of calorie density and that sort of thing. And it's a recipe for disaster for most people who don't think enough about what they're doing every day at the time that they're doing it to be successful. So some of what we're trying to do with some of our rules about no oils in your house and don't have the bag of cashews in your house and the whole 9 yards is we're trying to deal with the fact that a lot of what's going on with food is a function of automaticity. And so we have to protect people against themselves that way. So we know, you know, if you're not an Esselstyn type person who was going to die in 1985 and you're willing to do anything to be alive in 2016, that's not a lot of our we have some of that population, but it's not a lot of our population. So what we're trying to do is to get that person to do this and stay with it. We know that they're going to be exposed to some oils when they go out, when they travel. So if we limit it there, but in their own environment when they have control, have a little bit harder rule, you're more likely to get somebody to success, because it's hard for me. You know, I'm pretty disciplined about what I do, and I care a lot about my health, but I got to tell you something, there's some stuff that just calls my name from the kitchen. I like those yummy, higher fat things like everybody else, and so I find that it even helps me to just have some kind of hard and fast rules.
I don't know if I have anything to add to it other than that's one of the reasons, the high temperature, the oxidation that it produces. That's another reason I don't recommend oil as much as possible, because cooking it is going to expose it. And also the rancidity. You know, you don't know if it's rancid. You can't taste it. You can't smell it all the time. And so that's just going to promote more free radicals in the body. So why risk it? Try to omit it.
Oxidized fat is one of the worst things you could possibly get, and it will oxidize. I think cooking with oil is a really, really, really bad idea. So I generally recommend not to. The other thing is, you want extra virgin olive oil. Did you guys see the 60-minute piece that all these things are being labeled extra virgin olive oil, and they're not extra virgin olive oil at all? They're not even olive oil. Yeah, they're mixed nuts. It's crazy how we're so duped in this society. I actually was at a really expensive restaurant, and they had olive oil, and I dipped some bread in it, and it tasted different than anything I'd ever tasted. And I said, "This is the most incredible olive oil. What is it?" And he goes, "It's real olive oil." And so it just tasted like plant matter, and so it really had this great plant taste to it, which I'd never tasted before. The other thing is what we think is good, and the reason you want an extra virgin cold pressed olive oil is because the heating process oxidizes it. So she's absolutely right. It's absolutely I never even really thought about it, but it's ludicrous to get extra virgin cold pressed olive oil and then heat it. It's crazy.
And we were just a few months ago in Rome, and we bought extra virgin olive oil. It was green. It tasted chlorophyll.
Tastes like wheatgrass.
Yeah, me too. I was in Italy this summer too, and the oil was everywhere, but it was a very different entity than it is here.
To all of our friends listening from Greece, we apologize.
What about fruit?
Well, again, we don't think that fruit should be a large part of anyone's diet. I'm sympathetic with the people that are in practice. To get them off candy bars and put them on fruit, much better choice. But the fact of the matter is, when we were up in Boston and we had all the professors and researchers helping us, we established that even the healthiest specimens among us really shouldn't, because of this hybridization of sugar, high so sweet, should ever eat more than about 15% of our diet by weight as fruit.
So look for local fruit, because that is better chance that it will be ripe, because most fruit is picked unripe. You know if it comes from Mexico or if it comes from Spain or whatever, California, it was picked unripe. Even here in Florida, the oranges, if you see the big trucks coming, it's all green oranges and green grapefruits, and they don't ripen off the tree. You become the mother tree, really. All that calcium we were supposed to get from orange and grapefruit juice, you actually have to take calcium out to digest it. So that
for the teeth, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, for your teeth, for your bones, that's a disaster. So when I live in Florida, I try to take oranges from the trees, and let them sit there until they ripen. That is absolutely the best.
I think I would agree that fruit, if you look at our food diagram, starchy foods are at the bottom, whole grains and legumes and that sort of thing, and then vegetables, and then fruit. And so we always tell people, if you're eating more fruit than vegetables and starchy foods and whole grains, then you're probably overdoing the fruit. And it's easy to do because of the lovely sweet taste, which everybody likes. But fruits are densely nutritious. I agree, the locally grown are the best. They're also the ones that taste best too. If you buy things in season and you buy things that are locally grown, they're going to taste better, they're going to be fresher. And one thing also is for people who have economic limitations, buying directly from a producer often can make foods cheaper as well. So all for eating fruit, keeping it less than vegetables, less than grains, and local when possible.
I would never advise someone not to eat fruit. It's a wonderful, health-promoting, nutritious, natural, wonderful source of food, low calorie density. It takes, literally to get people off of dessert. I work with so many people that come to me with sugar addiction, and it is a magic answer is here, try to swap it to fruit. And fruit doesn't taste sweet at first for these people because the threshold of sweet is so high that it doesn't even taste sweet. But I've seen this for 20 years. I've been doing this, 24 years or 22 years, not to date myself. Yeah, I'm 73, so this works.
You've been doing this longer than me.
And I have seen time and time again, and myself included, that if you get off of those processed sugars and those artificial sugars and you switch it with fruit, all of a sudden, fruit becomes too sweet. I can't eat fruit anymore. It's too sweet for me. And I've seen this with so many people that natural, your palate completely changes. I think of it like a baby's palate. It's like it's all new and breast milk tastes sweet and everything's sweet. And then we just ruin it and we just violate our tongues and our taste buds for our whole lives and put all these really processed foods and artificial sweeteners are designed to be hundreds or thousands of times sweeter than table sugar. So that just messes everything up. You're having your Diet Coke and then you're still craving sugar. It perpetuates those sugar cravings. So I think fruit is a win-win-win. It's helped my husband get off of his sugar kick he had dessert his whole life. And but fruit is a wonderful answer for a lot of people, and it should not be avoided.
Allow me to go crazy here about how much I think fruit is probably the most ideal substance for us to eat. This was one thing I studied immensely because I wanted to study what are we most designed to eat, what are we supposed to be eating. Fruit, the antioxidant value of fruit, the fiber content, the effect on the microbiome, everything about fruit. And I've studied, I actually searched the literature to try to find something negative about fruit, to find some study that showed something negative with fruit, and I couldn't find it. I think fruit is fantastic. Fruit's been fruit, if I had besides my armamentarium of a knife, which I try not to use if I can, my other big weapon in the barrel is fruit, because I could get my patients to eat fruit. And I could get them to eat a lot of fruit. And the funny thing is I get a lot of groups of people that come to see me. I get vegetarians, I get vegans, I get raw vegans, and the healthiest people I ever meet are the fruitarians. And I don't believe it. Every time I see them, I'm like, there's something, you've got to be missing some. I don't know if you guys know Rawfully Christina. She's got a really big following, and she runs this farm co-op in Houston, and she delivers this, just talk about gorgeous, ripe, beautiful fruit that she delivers, and she eats fruit like crazy. The funny thing, she also eats seasonally. So coming about fall, she starts turning a little orange. But I tested her recently. There's a whole YouTube video about it. That is one healthy girl, and she eats so much fruit, and the people that follow her eat so much fruit. And anytime I test them, they are some healthy people. A guy, Michael Arnstein, who's a top athlete, big buckets of fruit. Rich Roll, tons of fruit. A lot of the healthiest people I know tend to eat the most fruit. Those in all the different groups. There's the starchitarians, and we're all. It's crazy how you could take vegans and make us into little cliques. But really, the fruitarians are really incredible. And I have found myself, just experimenting myself, anytime I increase the fruits, I perform better athletically. And so now I don't do those goo packets and stuff people do on runs. I'm fruiting it up. Dry fruits, oranges. I mean, I eat apples like they're going out of style. I think apples might be one. And then you can't. The other thing is you don't need to go to Brazil to a treetop to get an acai berry. Just eat a blueberry. Now they are, yes, we can get into the fact that they are hybridized. They're not the blueberries that used to be out there, but they're still extremely good for you. The ORAC value, the antioxidant value is through the roof, and so, yeah, eat your fruit. And by the way, no one has ever gotten fat off of fruit. I talked about this before, but de novo lipogenesis is in order to take that fruit and process it into fat, it is almost impossible. You would have to be on an extremely high calorie, unbelievably high carbohydrate diet. So I had this one patient who was like, well, can I eat too many apples? I was like, okay, I dare you to eat too many apples. And so she came in one day, she's like, I ate 5 apples yesterday. And we weighed her and she weighed less. And she's like, oh, no, okay, you win. So eat your fruit.
Let me just make a couple of comments. 35 years ago, by chance, we discovered that when dealing with people with cancer, that when they were eating large amounts of fruit, their cancer was growing and metastasizing. And this was a challenge for us, a very big challenge for us, because our diet at that point was probably half fruit, giving people. I got a call, finally, after pondering this for several years, from the fellow who was at that point running the Linus Pauling Foundation, one of Pauling's former Phi Beta Kappa students out of Stanford, Dr. Arthur Robinson. And he said, we finally pinned it that the fruit sugar was a pathway in precipitating the metastasis of all forms of cancer. So me especially, probably 60% of my diet was fruit at that point. We reluctantly put the brakes on, and kept in touch with him. And we're pretty much a lone wolf on that and started to look at why that was, and couldn't find anything in the medical literature. There was nothing. But in the agricultural literature, it was abundantly clear that the hybridization of fruit, and I agree, you can't find anything but hybrid food, and we'd probably die if we didn't do that. But reality was that the average fruit today has 30 times more sugar than the original. Then we'll take into account what Anna Maria stated earlier, that no fruit that's commercially sold, other than by chance or mistake, is ripe when it's picked. The only fruit that inherently ripens after you pick it from the mother plant is a banana. So now we've had a solid 35 years without fruit sugars, and I'll give you some science on this so you can catch up to it. And then 25 years, basically, where we use fruit. And the spectacular changes in disorders are remarkable. And then if you look at my colleague and friend who wrote the most definitive book on cancer, it should be mandated every doctor reads it who deal with cancer. Thomas Seyfried out of Boston College, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease. We held a medical conference about 3 years ago, and he was stunned that we didn't eat fruit, because everyone in the natural movement says fruit, 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 and the pathways and how it processes through. And he said, here, I'm going to show you what I've learned over the decades. He said that the only fruit, or the only sugar that acts like fat in the body doesn't create fat. All sugars create fat. So it happens to be fruit sugar. So I know this still goes against the literature.
Yeah, look, no, it doesn't go against the literature. You're actually correct. The effect is called the Warburg effect. That's what Seyfried studies. And what it is that cancer cells have to have sugar to survive. They only use cellular respiration using sugar. If you have cancer, I would agree with you. We were talking about this before. There is that effect. My idea is you don't want to get cancer to begin with, and fruits don't cause cancer. They will actually help prevent cancer. That's been shown in multiple studies. If you actually have cancer, you kind of want to go into ketosis. You don't want any carbohydrate. That's the only time, I'm a carb fanatic. The only time I would retract from my carb fanaticism would be if you actively have cancer, in which case I still want you getting phytonutrients, but you might want to watch out a little bit on the sugar side. But saying that sugar causes fat, we've done ward studies on this. Sugar cannot cause fat. It's de novo lipogenesis is almost impossible.
A study came out a week ago and discouraged people in British Journal of Medicine on smoothies, showing that it's creating weight. We've seen it with people too.
I use smoothies all the time. The only problem that you can get into, again, is people are downing. First of all, fruit juice, that's a different story, right? You're taking sugar away from the fiber.
What's the difference between fruit juice and a smoothie?
Well, it's fiber. That's the big difference. But what happens is when you're eating pure sugar, is you're getting a very quick rise in your sugar level, which causes a quick rise in insulin, which causes a quick drop in your sugar, which leads to you eating more. And
that's all Dr. Steer work out of Harvard.
Yeah,
I used to debate him.
And it's same with Jenkins' work with glycemic index, where you're really creating a higher glycemic index food by doing that. I think the problem with smoothies I get into people, and there was a good study that, I can't remember who did it, but they were showing that people...
Let's ask people in this room. How many of you in this room who ate a lot of fruit and put it in blenders and drank, 5 bananas or whatever you did in blenders, gained weight on that one? Raise your hand. Okay, nobody in the room. Usually in the room I get, 10 people in a room this size that say that. I know this is one way that we help people reduce weight, is take away condensed large amounts of sugar like that.
Now I use it as a weight loss tool, and I treat
too.
thousands and thousands and thousands of people for weight loss. It's a very successful weight loss tool. But I do agree with the Warburg effect. There's no question once you have a cancer cell. Now, my hope is that we prevent the cancer cell from getting there.
Well,
But if you're
let
gonna
me
avoid
explain
the
the
Warburg
Warburg effect.
effect, you
Back in
have-
1924, Warburg finished a 4-year study where he showed that all you had to do reduce is 1/3 of the oxygen in the bloodstream to precipitate cancer growth. He won the Nobel Prize for that years later. That's what Thomas Seyfried did 2 other studies on and proved his work was valid.
Well, but if you look at the Warburg effect and you're going to starve out the cancer cell, you're going to have to eliminate carbohydrate. You can't
Right.
just eliminate the fruit. And what Seyfried is proposing in his book, he's speaking at our conference in a few weeks, we've gotten to know him a little bit. What Seyfried is saying in his book, first of all, is he's proposing ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting and even long-term water fasting to a certain extent in order to weaken cancer cells and strengthen human cells so that you could even potentiate small amounts of chemotherapy for some types of cancer. And I think just like when Julieanna said, people look at the Mediterranean diet and they say, give me the olive oil, I'll have some red wine, people like to pick and choose. I think the problem is that if you're trying to address the issue of cancer cells liking sugar and having a preference for sugar and growing themselves, tumors growing themselves this way, eliminating the fruit and continuing to eat all the rest of it isn't really going to do much good. I would propose that what you really want to do is either put somebody, depending on the type of cancer. I think that's another thing too, is that a lot of Seyfried's book is about the types of cancer for which we do not have any solutions at this time, including dietary solutions. And so if you can turn it into a chronic condition through intermittent fasting, ketogenic diets, et cetera, so that somebody lives their full lifespan or maybe 20 or 30 years with a brain tumor that would have killed them within 6 months, it's a trade-off. So I think it's important. I think if people all read Seyfried's whole book, they would have a different impression than if they listened to somebody talk about one aspect of it.
And also keep in mind, the vast majority, everything he's done has been on rats. He does have some anecdotal, one person this and one person that.
Yeah, some of the anecdotals are at Hippocrates Institute.
Yeah, and the anecdotal, yeah, they are. And the anecdotal is interesting, but I would like to see more. And also True North had this, a anecdotal that was published where they did water fasting on a stage 4 lymphoma patient and it went away. There's definitely something to that though, but what I really want, it feels very Western medicine-y to be looking at how to treat we have to do that, look at how to treat the disease, but I still want us thinking about how to prevent the disease, and in that regard, fruit is very, very powerful.
Let me, because this is an important conversation I think we have, since over half the population will contract cancer. 57% of Americans will contract some form of cancer in their life. So Seyfried, who's under political scrutiny constantly and almost lost his tenure, had to water down his book. He told me that privately when I had him at a 3-day conference at Hippocrates. So to say that it was only on specific forms of cancer, if you read as clear as I have 10 times his book, it says it's every form of cancer: carcinoma, sarcoma, melanoma, etc. Number two, I think it's important that I agree with you that we shouldn't eat cooked carbohydrates that break down to sugar. Number three, in all the years I've done this work, basically what you end up seeing is that when you look at cancer, the best test for most forms of cancer is called a PET scan. A PET scan is actually where you inject sugar into the body. Now, we had a gentleman come to us who happened to be a research physician, and back in those days worked at Stanford, and took a gallon of organic apple juice, distilled out a cup and a half of sugar, and used it at Stanford for the PET scans one day. And it was exactly the same results they had, where the cancer goes to eat the sugar, you see the epicenter of the cancer, and you see the metastasis where it's moving. So that's when I really started to realize that we weren't on the wrong track, when PET scans became prominent about 30 years ago. We did this change 35 years ago. By 25 years ago, this gentleman did that work for us. And so these are serious issues. Now, I agree. Again, let's come back and take a breath. We're all telling you to eat a plant-based diet. We're saying to get you invited into this world, providing you're not sick, whatever plant-based diet you eat is a hell of a lot better than the diet you're on at this point. We also look at the socioeconomic sphere of this. I can't go in and say everyone eat organic food. Most of us sitting in this room are elitist. Many of you listening around the world probably have money too. But in some of those pockets that I've had the privilege to work in, you don't do that. So just eat plant-based diets. The least expensive diet on the planet Earth is a plant-based diet. No question. The healthiest diet is a plant-based diet. Now, how you do that is variation, but we do know a lot about disease and which ones work best. And by the way, the last thing I want to say is the anaerobic effect. That means that cancer cells do not like oxygen. But guess what? Viruses don't like oxygen, and bacteria do not like oxygen. And mold does not like oxygen, and fungus does not like oxygen. So we eradicated fruit for all those diseases for the last 30 years.
Actually, there's been pretty good studies with fruit and greens increasing vascularity and thereby bringing oxygen to cells. And there's some bacteria that love anaerobic conditions.
Well, you look at things like citrulline that you get off the skin of a watermelon. Throw the red part away, take the citrulline out of that. That's amazing vascular.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
What do you recommend regarding supplementation, dietary supplements?
This will be interesting.
So I wrote a book about 15 years ago called Supplements Exposed, and about 90% of the supplements on the market are mostly chemicals, and they are formulated under the word natural, and back in the 1930s, there was global attempts by the pharmaceutical industry, who still produces about 80% of the raw material for all supplements, to say that all we need to do is put 10% natural into it. Now, when I speak to my very conservative medical colleagues, they tell me, well, if you're saying take whole food supplements, and that's what we suggest, food or food extracts that haven't been heated above 110, 112 degrees, they're saying, how come the formula is the same? And I say, well, you know, sadly, we didn't have the consciousness to understand that what you get in a food has a lot of nuance and subcultures that we've yet to discover. Remember, the science of nutrition is only, it started in 1928 at Cornell University. It's a very young science. We're all learning. Every day of my life, I'm learning more and more and more. But what I do know is that we're not arrogant enough or smart enough to know everything that's in food. So I'd rather have a food extract or food itself ground up without it being heated and cooked and processed. So the medicinal part is gone, and that's what the supplement should be. So algae and pollens and whole food supplementation. And the other ones we've been looking at very, very seriously for decades. Literally, the immune system attacks them. So a lot of the vitamin C that's being injected, ascorbic acid, as my good colleague and friend said, when you write the book, don't make this abstract, an abstract book. What you do is tell what ascorbic acid is. It's only 1/8 of true vitamin C. You're missing 7/8. And the body's immunity identifies that.
I did do that.
I think that the way to approach supplements is that, with some exceptions, B12 would be one if you're eating a pretty strict vegan diet, that they should be looked at as medicines for the most part. And they can have some usefulness when used judiciously in a practice. My feeling about how we have a reverence for protein. Dr. Davis wrote a great book about that. We have a reverence for isolated nutrients. And my personal belief about that is because we discovered individual nutrients that were capable of resolving health issues like scurvy and beriberi. We didn't really know there were going to be 100,000 more nutrients discovered in food. We didn't understand the complexity of all of it. And so the mythology of the magical properties of the individual nutrient that solves problems carried over. And so when people talk about everybody needs to take lots of vitamins and multivitamins and all this, I've asked people at conferences, I mean, I don't know where you practice, but when is the last time somebody came in your office with scurvy or beriberi? Seriously, you know, people are suffering from whole food deficiencies. They're not suffering from particular vitamin deficiencies. And what concerns me a lot about people eating some version of the standard diet is that and I talked about this in my lecture on Thursday when we were looking at Alzheimer's patients, for example. Risk factors for Alzheimer's, which include higher intake of metals. Where is it all coming from? Well, they're eating it in the animal food, then they're eating it in the fortified foods, then they're eating it in a multivitamin, and people don't keep track of all those different sources of all those, and so they end up over consuming nutrients that in tiny amounts are actually essential and good for us, but in higher amounts, not so much. So I think some of this comes not only from the historical perspective of the nutrients having magical qualities, but also the idea in our culture that if a little bit of something's a good idea, 250 times as much must be fabulous. And that's actually not always the case.
I don't know how to follow that. Brilliant, absolutely agree. I have such a hard time with supplements because we need B12. If you're on a vegan diet, you absolutely need B12. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. There's a big global prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, so I recommend people don't just blindly supplement, but they go and get tested to see what their serum D levels are and then make a decision on it. But I also am on the other side where I don't trust it. Have you seen any of those blind studies where they'll go out and they'll take a supplement and get it actually analyzed, and it's almost never what it says on the label? So you don't know what additives you're getting or fillers you're getting and what the dosing you're getting. So to me, it feels really kind of like a shot in the dark. But on the other side, we do need B12, and so it's a good question. I'm very open-minded to this because I think it's an evolving science. But I think that the idea of taking a multivitamin on top of a standard American diet and thinking you're going to be okay is not it's not a magic bullet, and that's one of the most important parts, in my opinion.
Yeah, the health professions study from Harvard looked at physicians over years, and they did find a benefit to people on a longevity scale that were taking vitamins, but the people that were taking vitamins tended to be healthier in general. It tended to be a selection of people that, they were taking vitamins because they had tried to do things that were healthy. Most of the vitamin studies have shown no benefit, and there's been a lot of stuff lately saying not to do. I was fascinated by a New England Journal of Medicine article or was it Lancet? I can't remember, where they were following a group of people that had lung cancer. And they had found that in places where they had a lot of vitamin A intake, there was no lung cancer, and that it would improve it, so they thought they would give these people vitamin A. And guess what happened? Their lung cancer got worse. They had to stop the study because they got more medicine in worsening with the vitamin A. So a lot of these things that we think are benign, we think it may be good for us, it may do nothing, I'm going to take the chance, it may actually be detrimental to us. So I get a little bit nervous with some of these things. I heard actually in Hippocrates, you guys give blue-green algae? Do you worry? Okay, as a medical doctor, the one disease that scares the living day out, I always think I'm getting it too, because I'm so scared of this disease, is ALS. Like my finger will twitch. I'll be like, oh my God, I'm dying of ALS. And it's a terrible way to die. And they've been looking a lot at what causes ALS, and BMAA, which is a serine analog, has been found to be associated with it, and they find that in blue-green algae. So now I fear blue-green algae and spirulina because of but I don't know, I just don't know. I mean, doesn't that make you worried?
There's, the original life form on the planet was blue-green algae, so there's wide varieties of them.
Right.
And so that's the concern, and I'm sure in some you'd find that. Two things, back in '68, polling said it well. There's no disease that doesn't have a nutritional deficiency component. So it was 1905 when William Fletcher in England wiped out beriberi with his own little fingers, taking the nutritious part off brown rice, putting it in a pill, and he created B vitamins. The very first nutrient we ever discovered was 1905. And from that point, 1912, a Polish-born guy that worked at the Lister Institute, and Lister was as smart as Pasteur, never got the credit, literally said, let's call this vitamin. And the word vitamin is really a hip name. Vita from Greek meaning life, and amine from nitrogen, growth. So the word vitamin means life growth. And from 1905 to 1955, 85% of the nutrients that we've are using today were discovered. Can you imagine how many more there are? We really didn't know what a phytochemical was until the 90s. We discovered it not we, but somebody discovered it in 1948. 92, they did the work at Johns Hopkins and said this stuff, basically kills cancer. And now they say right across the board, I write books on this, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, mental illness, neurological problems. But ALS in early stage, you can put a brake on that one. Late stage, usually hyperbaric chambers, glutathione IVs, radical shifts, and now we're vaporizing the glutathione too, which is phenomenal.
Glutathione is very powerful antioxidant.
One thing I wanted to add with reference to vitamin D, which is sort of the craze, there's always a shiny new thing in healthcare, and everybody wants to trot on after it. While I think that vitamin D can be beneficial for very small populations of people, the problem with population screening for vitamin D is that we have now close to 1,000 studies showing that vitamin D levels are often depressed because of disease, not the cause of disease. There's a big difference between those two things. One of the best ones, the easiest to explain, it was done in Georgia at an emergency room where hyperglycemic patients who were so hyperglycemic they had to be taken to the emergency room. When they got there, blood tests, very low vitamin D levels, 12.3 average. As soon as blood sugar was stabilized, jumped up to 27 point something. Okay, so you can see how the ridiculousness of giving these people vitamin D supplements, hoping you're going to change their condition. Their condition changing is going to change the vitamin D levels. The other thing is that we had set, it was an estimate, safe vitamin D levels about 12.5 until the disease mongering started. And now it just depends on what lab you send the specimen to, the blood test to, what you're going to get back in terms of a reference range. And some of them are 75 to 100, which means everybody qualifies for supplementation. And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force issued a report, it was either last year or the year before, saying we have to stop this nonsense. The Institute of Medicine issued a report, we have to stop this nonsense. We have no idea if higher vitamin D levels are better. We have no idea what the consequences are of supplementation. One study showed that 3,000 international units a day increased fat stores of vitamin D by 337% in 90 days. And the researchers concluded, we don't know what this means, but we think until we figure it out, we ought to put the brakes on this. So I think if you're in kidney failure, you're a good candidate for vitamin D. I think if you're in a nursing home and you haven't been outside since 1982, you probably ought to take some vitamin D. There would be some special cases, but we've tried. I said this in a couple of my talks. The money in medicine, whatever the branch, is in taking something that helps a small group of people and translating it into a population program. Because if everybody's doing it, you got $1 billion or $1 trillion market. If you reserve these things for the populations that benefit, you just can't make as much money.
You know, it's funny, like in bariatric surgery, they tell us to supplement everybody with these huge regimens of vitamins, and then the vitamin companies come and pay you to do it, so there's a big financial incentive for me to sell vitamins. But I can't do it with good conscience. And so what I do is, I'll check their vitamin D level, but that's not all. I'm checking their parathyroid hormone, which controls calcium. And if their parathyroid hormone's sky high, that means they're not getting enough calcium. Then I know that the low vitamin D is significant. But if their parathyroid hormone's normal, then I don't care what their vitamin D level is. But no one's doing that. They're just saying buy vitamin D. So I don't know. Buyer beware.
Before we leave this subject, two people mentioned that vegans have to watch B12. Well, about more than 20 years ago, the Framingham group out of Boston, Harvard offshoot, put a study out and showed that the B12 studies on most medical blood tests, and they haven't changed, are wrong. They may say you have it and you don't have it, or you don't have it and you have it. And we were stunned because we were the place that, every once in a while some legitimate organization would come and say, hey, people on your diet must have B12 deficiencies, and we'd say, oh, look at the blood tests. They really don't after they've been on this a while. That blew us out of the water because the blood test was wrong. So we started to do SpectraCell test back then, and here's what I've discovered. I've looked at 11,222 people as of 3 days ago with these more sophisticated tests. Meat eaters, fish eaters, dairy eaters, chicken eaters have an 8% higher incidence of B12 deficiency than vegans, because B12 is not a B vitamin. It's a soil-based microorganism, and vegans have a deficiency too. Why? Because that blew my mind. It took me 3 years. I went to every medical library I could. Our intestinal tract has radically de-evolved. It's radically different than it was hundreds of years ago, not thousands, hundreds of years ago. And we don't have the little pocket where the food, which was all organic, by the way, until the Second World War, we used to sit and culture the bacteria, the soil-based bacteria B12. And so Dr. Fontana from Washington University of Bologna did a study on raw food vegans and showed we have less, but we still have B12 deficiencies because it's an anatomical problem. So everyone needs a B12 supplement, and you better get a bacterial form. Most on the market are not. You also have to look at your genetics. There's a small group, now we do genetic testing, a small group of people that need, unfortunately, a methyl, but we try to get a food-based methyl form, and it's a small group, probably less than 5–10%, but the truth of the matter is there's a lot of considerations now we didn't know 5 years ago.
I thought to myself that, because I've seen some people that are vegan that don't have B12 now, I measure B12, but once again I measure MMA to see the actual pathway, so is there an actual real deficiency? But I had one girl came in and she had a normal B12, normal MMA. She never takes any supplements, doesn't believe in them. And I asked her why, and she said because she has organic soil that she doesn't till, that she takes the carrot out of the soil and eats it without washing it. And then I started trying to do that, so I got this organic local farm, and they would send me food, but like I would take this thing out and there would be worms crawling on it and stuff.
His wife questioned him around that
Yeah,
time.
and so I couldn't do it for long enough to test myself. But do you think that if we were eating like that, we would need a B12? Because I'll tell you that everyone's argument is veganism's wrong because you need a B12 supplement,
Yeah,
which is
well,
ridiculous.
Meat eaters need it too, so.
But everybody, and I check more meat eaters B12s than probably anybody, because I do a lot of lab testing, and I see lots of B12 deficiency meat eaters.
I think
Lots.
the answer is, in the long run, yes, but probably it may take a generation or more to get
to
back
change
to
the
that.
soil and get the bacteria.
I just have to insert something that Steve has been so patient with a group of health professionals who are incapable of following directions. We were told that we were going to get 30 seconds to answer a question.
I don't know how we passed
and
the
then we
test.
were going to take turns, and we have completely ignored the instructions and gotten away with it for the greater part of almost an hour and a half. And so thank you, Steve, and we apologize.
At least,
Let's try to stay to 30 seconds and get 2 more questions. Go quick.
Okay, so as a penalty for going over the 30 seconds, I'd like for each of you to write this down. I'm going to give you 19 questions, and each of you have to answer each of them. You have 2 minutes to answer all 19 questions.
Now, if we can do this, we have to be canonized.
So I'll give you the questions, and then each of you answer them with a 3 to 5 second answer for each one. So
3 to 5 seconds.
So here are the questions. For survivalists who want to store food for the next 5 years, what should they store? Number 2, what about white potatoes? Number 3, what about cooking in tomato sauce?
I feel like this is a test.
I know.
Number 4,
Worse than medical test. I'm like looking at what she's writing.
What did you say?
Number 4, what about using vinegar?
Using what?
Using vinegar. Number 5, is tofu better than soy burgers and soy dogs and soy cheese? Number 6, what about food combining? Number 7, is seitan or wheat gluten, it's the same thing, something to avoid? Number 8, what about cooked sweet potatoes and squashes? Number 9, what about fermented foods like sauerkraut? Number 10, what about pickles? Number 11, what about mushrooms? Number 12, what about avocados? Number 13, what about non-dairy milks? Like rice milk, hemp milk, those kind of milks. Next one, what about kombucha? Next, what about protein powders made from raw plants, like the sprouted brown rice and hemp powders? Next, what about salt? Next, should we take hot showers or cold showers?
After this cold?
Last 3, should we avoid airplane flying to avoid radiation? Do we need colonoscopies? And do you use a cell phone? You could each comment on each of those points, and your whole thing should be 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Colonoscopies and cell phones.
Should we avoid airplanes to avoid radiation from flying?
If I can do these in 3 to 5 seconds, please give me a hug after this. I'm Irish. This is like putting me in jail or something. Survival is very clear. It's grains. So you put grains, you can put them in dry ice, in a container, put tape around it, and they'll last for a minimum of a decade. White potatoes we're not big fans of, although you can take organic white potatoes, juice them, let the starch settle at the bottom. They're terrific. Anna Maria Center, she directed in Sweden, was using this in the conquest of arthritic and rheumatoid conditions. Tomato sauce, unlike my colleague at the end, cooked, it does not have the phytochemicals in it. I had a debate with the doctor out of Johns Hopkins, and I basically said, you created a whole brand new science. You actually manifested something after cooking it. All I know about cooking is everything else destroys things. So I'm not a big fan of the phytochemical thing. Vinegar we do not use on food, but as a therapeutic thing, it's amazing because it impairs the digestion of food. Therapeutically, raw apple cider vinegar and water is terrific to pull acidity out of the body. And these jerks selling $60 bottles of alkalizing drops, let me tell you, a $2 bottle of raw apple cider vinegar is just as good. It just works tremendously. Tofu we're not a fan of. It's an inert object. It really doesn't work. Cheese, I would probably say it's probably better than cheese, but you know, it's a little pregnant or a lot of pregnant. We're big fans of food combining because if you look at, I do a whole 3-hour presentation on the history of man's diet, and I show nomads were eating very simply, one food at a time. They weren't really cooked at the beginning until we got into the north. When we, you know, as a committed vegan, if I were in the north and freezing to death and my children were starving, I'd probably change my mind about being a vegan. And when they started to eat the food up at that stage, they probably cooked it at some point. Sweet potatoes and squash I'm a major fan of. If you look at sweet potatoes and why this, which group was it that ate a lot of sweet potatoes? In Okinawa? Okinawa. Yeah, this is one of the most nutritious foods. Even after being cooked, it's loaded with minerals and loaded with, you know, phytochemicals when you eat it raw. And you can eat it raw. By the way, at Thanksgiving here in America, we mush it up, and you'd actually think it was cooked. And squash is equally good. And by the way, I found when I was still eating emotionally and I needed to be filled up, squash did the job. It made me feel like I was eating heavy stuff, but it was mostly water. It was really a great food for a transition. All of the 5 blue zones, now they added a 6. 4 of them use fermented food. We're big fans of that. And the more we know about the bacteria in the intestinal tract and the 2/3 of your body's bacteria, the more we should study this and encourage it and use fermented foods. You can buy pickles without vinegar. Burpees out of Chicago, you get them in most of the health stores. That I'm a big fan of. I'm not a fan of the vinegar-based ones. Although if you cheat on that once in a while, it's not going to kill you. Better than smoking cigars. Some mushrooms, great. Other mushrooms, not. Look at the most important work I've seen in the alternative medical field was out of Asia on the medicinal properties of particular mushrooms. And I don't know a lot about it, but there's a brilliant guy out of Vancouver that talks about wild mushrooms. And every time I hear him, I learn brand new things that are stunning. As far as avocados, big fans of it, but don't eat too much of it. Avocado also has glutathione in it, as does asparagus, as does pistachios. And non-dairy milk, don't buy them. You know, as Anna pointed out a little earlier, get some raw nuts. Get them in your blender. Yes, you're going to oxidize them some in blenders, but blend it up. If you want it thick, put more. If you want it less, put pure water in. Put some stevia, put some whatever you like in there. And now you have 1/4 or 2 quarts for the week and much healthier and a lot less expensive. Remember, they cook those things at very high temperatures and put a lot of interesting things in. A lot of them have seaweed in it to give you that creamy. And that particular seaweed is not really the best seaweed. It's a junk seaweed they use for that. We're not at all fans of kombucha. What they do is they take water, and I've never seen one that used pure water. I look at this, probably 30 or 40 of them around the world as we travel. Kombucha, they put sugar in water, and it grows some mold, and then they give you some mystical story about how that's great for you. Well, sugar water is not good for you. I don't care what it develops into. Protein powders, big fan of, especially if you want to bodybuild or, you know, remember, protein doesn't put weight on your body unless you rip your muscle. You could eat 2 pounds of the best protein powder in the world every day and not gain an ounce. It's carbohydrates that put, you know, weight on your body. So you need to rip your muscle and basically put that on there. And they're great. We happen to like the ones that are based on fermented brown rice because it also has something called IP6 in it. Look that up. We don't have time to talk about it. It's a major anti-cancer phytonutrient. As far as salt, we're not happy about, table salt. And by the way, most of these new salts they charge 10 times more money for are sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, sodium chloride. So very small amounts. Do we need sodium? You bet. You die without sodium. Your lymph glands literally need sodium as an antiseptic. Your lymph glands are the local police station of immunity and also the major filter system through your body. That's why every day we give people organic celery juice at Hippocrates, celery seeds. We'd prefer that. Now, occasionally when we have people get really weak, we'll give them the purest salts we can to sort of bring them back up. It's like jump starting a car, but it's really not sustainable to take sodium chloride over a long period of time. Not a great idea. Hot or cold showers? Well, it depends upon how horny you are. We had to have some humor in this. When you take a hot shower, Anna Maria taught me this, she's Swedish, they're Vikings. After a hot shower, you should always follow it up with a cold shower. Now, here in Florida, it's easy. Our cold showers mean it's 70 degrees versus 95 degrees. So, and when you're up north, it's a little different. It's a challenge. Then a plane, the data and studies on that are just stunning, although I never stop taking planes. From New York to Los Angeles is the equivalent of 18 x-rays. From New York to London is 24 x-rays. And so while you have this so-called jet lag, and we all look horrible when we get off the plane, and you look at pilots being one of the sickest professions in the world. I mean, I've dealt with more cancer pilots and flight attendants than any other profession out there. The pilots come to us. More and more intelligent and educated pilots are coming and scaring us. We thought we knew, and today they're freaking us out and saying, here's the latest data on this. To check your colon, I mean, of course, doctors do this because people are eating horribly bad diets. And it's not a bad suggestion. If you're eating bacon every day, as the World Health Organization said, cured meats give you cancer, 20% more cancer with this just 4 months ago. Sure, you maybe want to stick that up. Eat well. If you don't have a recent history of a colon problem, colitis, diverticulitis, then I don't think you need to do that consistently. And by the way, they have something called a virtual colonoscopy, although it involves a CAT scan, which isn't great in itself. The truth of the matter is they don't have to stick something up. They can use this. You just have to find somebody who makes money on that, and then they'll do it for you. And then cell phones, we know from all the work that was done by the leading authority and oncologist out of Sweden how bad they are, directly linked to brain cancer. One of our colleagues who has been at The Real Truth About Health and a friend now, Dr. Dever Davis, one of our top scientists in America, how it creates cancer. I also think it implicates with neurological diseases and learning disorders, and the list goes on. And this is a work in progress. Thank you. You time me? I can't even hold this.
I didn't write what everything was for. The first one, of course, I would store beans and grains. And I can do tons of stuff with that. And white potato, unless, I really don't need the potato juice anymore. I have the green drinks. It gives me so much more nourishment. And so white potato, otherwise, it's so starchy. Diabetes Foundation puts white potato #1, not to eat if you have diabetes. You can imagine how much sugar. And I prefer not to put tomatoes. And we can make tomato sauce in a blender. We could just put tons of oregano and garlic and rosemary and basil. And then, add, once it's out of the blender, add a little bit of olive oil. So much better for you. Okay, the vinegar as bacteria cleanse, yes, like 2 tablespoons and a glass of warm water first thing in the morning, amazing. Doesn't fit with your salad, you ferment everything you ate, although if that's what makes you tick, to have a dressing with vinegar and olive oil or other good cold pressed oils, and you'll eat that salad, it's better to eat the salad than if that makes you go. Tofu is the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to nutrition. There's really not much nutrition, and you will process it because it tastes like nothing. And food combination, yes, very important. If you want to be gassy or you don't want to digest well and you want to have a good elimination too, you follow that and you do good. And number 7 was no good I brought. And okay, 8 was good, sweet potato squash. 9 was good, and 10 was good, and 11 was good.
You have to say what they were.
Well, yeah, I didn't write what they were. 12 was great. At 13, I know, 13 was... I know! 13, I know that's mushrooms. Maitake, shiitake, of course, there's amazing mushrooms out there. Mushrooms, of course, is... in a forest, they are holding it all together. They're nourishing every tree, and it's a symbiotic relationship between mushrooms. So, of course, they're very good for us, but in moderation. And kombucha is sugar water. We don't need it. And then we had protein powder is good, mineral salts. Yeah, there are mineral salts. It's like, salts are actually pink or gray. And so you find that, and like we right now have one that's non-radioactive scalar treated. And so that one we use a little bit. Sometimes our guests need, especially first thing in the morning, they need electrolyte water, and because there's no sodium in that, sometimes we have to add a little bit of that. Otherwise, we have seaweed salts, seaweeds from kelp, nori, dulse, and we can add that instead. 17 was yes. What was that? 18. Well,
Will you love your husband for the rest
yeah,
of
okay, yes. And 18, well, we can't avoid, but going in airplanes, of course, we can't avoid, but we can help our thyroid, which is the worst hit of any form of radiation. So iodine is a good source. And, fluoride, stay out of fluoride, stay out of, really, soy blocks it, gluten blocks it, a lot of things that, and bromide, of course. So there's a lot of things that could work the other way. So fill up with some seaweeds. Bring seaweeds, dulse, eat seaweeds while you're flying. That's a good idea. And 19 was, yes, of course, like there's virtual colonoscopy if needed, and it really all depends on your lifestyle. But I know, of course, a lot of our guests that comes have been told after 50, you really need to do a colonoscopy. So if you do, you better do it with somebody who's really, really trained, because I also have heard horror stories of punctuation. 20 was yes.
What was the one?
Cell phone, yes, but we can protect ourselves. There are little things that are GIA that you can use, and they do show that they have some protection, but nothing is 100%. So please don't wear it in your bra or in your pants.
Tell the study at Yale and Exeter.
Yeah, you do.
There was a study at Yale and then repeated at Exeter, and they said when a man or a boy puts a cell phone in his pocket near his testes, within a matter of 30 seconds, 40% of the sperm has stopped at that stage.
Yeah. I'm done.
Okay. The first thing I want to say, because I am going to go through these really quickly, is I would not want my saying yes or no to something to make you think that there are magical foods or magical nutrients. In other words, it's a dietary pattern. I explain this all the time. Combination lock to open the safe. You can't open, if there's $10,000 in the safe, 4 numbers to open the lock. Dial up 3 numbers, you don't get $7,500. You've got to get the pattern right. So let's just put that out there. I'm in agreement. Grains and beans are the survivalist storage food. White potatoes, I don't have any problem with them. The ADA, the American Diabetes Association, promotes a diet that is not the diet eaten by people who don't have diabetes all over the world. And starch is what people all over the world are living on. And the other thing I wanted to say about the glycemic index, that comes up with the potato thing. If you follow the glycemic index, it's better to eat ice cream than carrots. All right. So the only way you can follow the glycemic index is to cherry pick the certain things and hope nobody goes and reads the whole chart. Yeah. I have tried hard, because I like that guy, to really come up with some way to buy into it, and I just can't do it. Cooking in tomato sauce, no problem. It increases lycopene. Vinegar, I don't see any problem with that. I don't see any problem with tofu. I mean, tofu for some people, I like it. I don't think it's a magical food. I think, again, if you like it, eat it. If you don't, that's fine. Processed, I think, is it better than the processed tofu hot dogs and all that stuff? Of course. But, we're trying to teach people to live in the real world. And here's a way to make your diet seem really attractive to other people, is when somebody goes out of their way to have a veggie burger for you at the Memorial Day picnic, say, I don't eat processed food. And everybody will go, gosh, I want to be like her. Sign me up for that. Again, folks, we're going to go out and live like real humans in doing this. Food combining, I just don't see enough science to recommend it. I said before, every layer of restriction you put on this just makes it harder for people to do. No problem with seitan for people who don't have a problem with gluten, which is most of them. Sweet potatoes and squash, I think we all agree those are great foods. Fermented foods like sauerkraut, I think they're great, but they don't have magical properties, and people eat a lot of this type of food thinking it's going to solve their problem. And as part of a health-promoting diet, great. If you don't like it, I don't think leaving it out of the diet is going to hurt you. Pickles, if you're eating too many of them, I guess that's a problem, but if you like them, fine. Mushrooms, I think, can be really good health-promoting foods. We probably should eat more of those. Avocados, 1 cup of avocado has 21 grams of fat. You just can't eat too much of the stuff and stay lean. I mean, it's just, you can't. So again, if it's part of a dish, no problem with that. Non-dairy milks, I think it'd be great if everybody made their own. If I had to do it, I'd have to go back to drinking cow's milk again because I don't have time. I just don't have time. And I have a commercial kitchen and people who work for me who I could tell them to make it and then we would not get the production done every day and my business partners would quit and we'd have all kinds of problems. So I'm one of those folks who's going to the store and buying the almond milk and, if I'm on the way to killing myself, what can I say? Kombucha, I'm on board, not such a good idea. Protein powders, my problem with excess protein. If you eat too much animal protein, it increases your risk of cancer. If you eat too much protein, period, you're going to blow out your kidneys sooner or later. Because all protein has to be digested and throws off the nitrogen and the amino acid chains, throws off toxic byproducts that are detoxified by the kidney. Human protein needs are very low, and I'll just take 10 seconds and explain this. People think that you have to replace protein every day in the body, but protein is like the fountain in the town square with 500 gallons of water, all right? They don't go put 500 new gallons every day in the fountain. They replace what splashed out and what evaporated, all right? So that's the way it is with protein. These amino acids circulate throughout the body, they recirculate throughout the body. All you're replacing is what actually got used up. You can use nitrogen studies to figure out that it isn't very much. So I don't want anybody adding extra protein to their diet. Salt, a lot of debate about the salt issue. The Institute of Medicine just published a revised report saying that their previous opinion was wrong, that most people shouldn't salt restrict. Too much salt restriction, too much salt intake, both are bad for you. In the middle, and the middle is shockingly higher than you might think, 3,000 to 6,000 milligrams a day is where people should fall, unless you are a person who should not eat salt because it spikes your blood pressure or you retain water. If that's a small percentage of the population, this is another one where we're trying to generalize the whole population into one set of restrictions, and that really doesn't work. I see a lot of sick vegans in my office who've been salt restricting, they've got asthma, and they've got allergies, and they have got to have some salt. And it shocks their system when I tell them, but it really does help them. Airplanes, I'm sure there's radiation, or hot and cold showers. I love heat, you guys all know that. I've been, I almost went upstairs and got the bedclothes and brought them in here yesterday because it was so cold in this room. So I love heat, and the cold shower for me would be very torturous. So I probably won't do that, even if it's good for me. I'm sure that there's some danger in riding in airplanes, but I think we have to put things in perspective. I have acrylic nails, just so you know. I'm sure that's not the best thing. And in case you haven't figured out, I'm 60 years old. It's probably not my hair color. We actually don't know what it is, and we're not going to find out anytime soon. And probably that's not the best thing for me, too. And I think if we take apart every little thing that we do in our life and we try to avoid all risk, we're just not going to leave the house. And I think we forget that DNA changes in response to sunlight, too. There are environmental toxins, even before we started polluting the world, there are environmental toxins out there we've managed to survive. And so I think that this idea of avoiding all risk is probably not attainable. And we're going to scare people about the wrong things. I don't want people not flying in airplanes while they're eating cheese. All right, so let's keep our eye on the bigger picture here. Colonoscopy, there's not a single randomized controlled trial that has ever shown that having a colonoscopy reduces your risk of dying of colon cancer. The Canadian Preventive Services Association, I can't remember, it's like the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, the Canadian equivalent, issued a report saying that for a population screening tool, it's virtually useless and advising against it. Dr. Gilbert Welch has been advising against it as a population screening tool for a long time. Cell phones, I just want to let you know, I have 2. So if I'm going to kill, so if I'm going to kill myself, I'm doing it on steroids here. So I think that's another thing. Do I think there's the potential risk associated with this? Yes, but at what point in time? I also wear makeup. Julieanna is wearing makeup. I mean, no. At what point in time? How much are you going to try to do this living without any exposure? And it becomes almost impossible. I mean, when I was in South Africa, I was petting cheetahs. I'm sure that wasn't safe, but it was really worth doing. All right, so I don't think you can remove all risks. So thank you.
Okay. I don't know about survivalism, except that I live in Los Angeles, an earthquake world, so I always have bottled water just in case. Don't love bottled water, but just in case. And I always have lots of canned beans because I can live on beans. And grains, of course, keep long too. White potatoes, no problem as long as they're not fried. Cooking in tomato sauce, I love it. It increases a phytochemical. Saw lots and lots of research on that. Love vinegar, delicious and nutritious and alkalizing. Tofu, I love tofu. Again, not a magic bullet, but it's a wonderful source of all sorts of great nutrients. As opposed to more processed foods, yeah, of course you want to stay as intact, but I consider it a whole food. Food combining, have not seen research to support food combining. I have seen people that don't do well when they mix fruit with other things because it is so quickly absorbed naturally that other things just slow it down so much in the GI tract. So people that have digestive issues, I do recommend trying keeping fruit separate, but I still haven't seen support in the literature. Seitan, definitely avoid if you are gluten sensitive, intolerant, or have celiac disease, otherwise it's fine. Cooked squashes, fantastic. Fermented foods, delicious. I love sauerkraut, one of my favorite foods. Pickles, delicious. You know, again, yeah, you're eating tons of it. The whole sodium thing is an issue. How much are you eating? And really, I'd rather people overeat pickles and cheese also. Mushrooms, fabulous, wonderful. They have that umami flavor, a lot of nutritional properties, a lot of wonderful long stuff, good stuff on mushrooms. Love avocados. In moderation, high in fiber too, which they're just wonderful, delicious foods. Non-dairy milks, I too don't have the wherewithal to make my own milks, and they're wonderful sources of calcium and vitamin D when you get them fortified. And that my kids, you know, it's a great way to have cereal and have something ready to go in the house. So I always have non-dairy milks at home. Kombucha, I have not seen evidence to support it. Sometimes I think it's yummy. Me and my friend will have it when we go to lunch, but I haven't seen any evidence to support it being beneficial. I can't read my own writing. Something raw. Protein powders. Do not recommend protein powders. I am a personal trainer for 22 years. I've worked with a lot of athletes, elite athletes, pro athletes, all types of athletes, strength athletes, huge athletes, small athletes, endurance athletes. All of them I've seen many of them do just as well without protein powders. I worry about a concentrated source of protein. It's a processed food. It is a processed food because you're concentrating something and getting rid of other things. I don't think they're necessary. Salt, I see all the controversy with salt. The preponderance of salt anyway. Sodium comes from processed foods. If you're eating whole plant foods, you're going to have a more healthy dose of sodium naturally. Hot or cold showers. I've heard that putting cold showers at the end of your hot on your hair is good for making it shiny. I can't corroborate that. I can't tolerate the cold either. When it goes cold, I get really grumpy. But I love hot baths and hot showers. I hate absolutely everything to do with flying, except that it gets me from point A to point B, and I really like to get to point B, and I like to travel the world, and so I know that they're not safe, and I am with Dr. Popper on that. I am not an expert on colonoscopies, but I am shocked by all the stuff I continue to learn from Dr. Popper on it. Have not had one yet personally. Do not tell people whether or not to do it. Cell phone, I think I have my cell phone attached to my hip, but I don't recommend putting it attached to your head. So I keep it away from the head. I use a speakerphone. Yes, they're dangerous, but I absolutely think they're amazing. And if you haven't downloaded the new iOS if you're Apple users, it's really kind of fun. But yeah, I love technology, and so yeah.
Okay, so store grains and legumes. What was two? Can you say two again? I can't remember. White potatoes. Oh, white potatoes, great. In fact, if you look at some of the healthiest cultures, they thrive on white potatoes. It's an excellent source if you're an athlete, and Dr. Holt did this great study where he was looking at satiety, which I showed you today, and potatoes are a great source of satiety, which I don't understand. It may be the complexity of the starches, but it outperforms everything when it comes to satiety, so I use it a lot with my patients and get good results. Tofu, I love. Let's see, is there anything that's different than everybody else? Obviously, you know, I'm going to go crazy over the protein powder. Nothing could be less needed in the world than protein powder. And if we're talking about chemicals, they did a recent study, heavy metal laden, arsenic laden, horrible chemicals in these protein powders. I don't think anybody, there's big, huge bodybuilders that don't use protein powders. And if they're not using protein powders, you certainly don't need to use protein powders. Salt is a great source of iodine, unless you're getting dulse. I would love it if people use dulse. Dulse is a great source of electrolytes, like she was mentioning, but not a lot of people have. I have a hard time finding dulse, believe it or not. And so I use iodinated salt because you need to get iodine. It is true that cruciferous vegetables and soy will scavenge iodine, but if you're getting enough iodine, that's not going to matter much. There was a great study done on vegans showing that they do not have more hypothyroidism, as everybody thinks that they do. They do not have more hypothyroidism, but you do want to keep that in mind. Cold showers, there's this movement looking at brown fat. If we could get people to generate brown fat, we have white fat. If you could generate brown fat is highly increases your metabolism. They think that maybe in cold environments you can increase that brown fat. There's been some studies on this, but it is definitely, the jury is still out. There was a guy who came to see me who's a famous researcher at Baylor, and he said, I'm onto it, I've got the answer, and no kidding, he died the next week. And so the answer has been lost. He was telling me he had the answer to brown fat, and then he died. There's also benefits to sauna. There's actually a recent study that came out to the benefit, and you would know this in the Swedish literature, that Sweden and Finland, I think it was, that you could develop heat shock proteins, and this might actually help you. So I do think there's a benefit to sauna. There was a study that they had less heart disease just by doing sauna, and it seemed pretty well controlled. I'm not sure. I don't know much about radiation from planes and cell phones, so I can't comment.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more thing, but I first want to just say that as soon as we're done, if the speakers would step next door to answer questions and sign some books just for a few minutes, you can go next door. This might be your last opportunity if you want to buy books. Tomorrow, Julieanna Hever will be making her presentation in the morning at 9 o'clock, and Brian Clement will be making the final presentation of the conference at 11 o'clock. I want to thank all the people from over 81 countries who tuned in to this conference. I want to thank all the people who came from Orlando, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you. You've made a huge contribution. All the speakers who came took their time. We're a small conference, but they came anyway. It made a huge difference. For anyone who has seen any part of this conference that they've liked, the entire conference is, 1, completely on replay. 2, there are 30 hours off stage that you didn't see. Each speaker did an interview. That's available. 3, it's all transcribed. 4, we took every lecture, like this lecture tonight, and we're making it into 15 smaller videos with a title. So if you want to show someone something, you don't have to watch the whole thing. You could go right to that thing, right to that specific video. So we're going to make 15 videos out of the panels and 10 videos out of each regular lecture. And we're making a 5 and a 15-minute highlight video from each lecture. So I hope everyone who has seen this will buy it. It's much more effective to convince your parents, friends, family about this stuff if you show them a video from an expert. Also, if you want to support this, if you liked what you saw and you felt good about the conference and good about the energy and good about the intention, we have absolutely no source of revenue at all except the conference. So I hope anyone who feels this was a good value will buy the $99 replay. For those of you that don't, thank you. Anyway, we love that you supported this conference and want to make a difference. And that's it. So let me just give each of you one 30-second final conclusion that you want to say to wrap up your whole this and the conference and any final thoughts. 30 seconds each.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for the last 5 years, for the real truth about health in this conference. I love you like a brother, and I honor you and respect you for what you do. Thank you.
I want to send you home with the feeling of, I can change something, that I got something out of this that will make my life happier and healthier, because, I think we all strive to want to have health in our life, and it's a jungle out there. It's a jungle to find our way, and I hope that you've heard a lot of opinions here through this week, and that the jungle is clearer. We're clearing a way for you in there, and it's a wonderful thing to just commit to doing something, to taking the first baby steps into a different lifestyle, because we all have been in a lifestyle where we were taught meat means protein, dairy means calcium, and cooking is important. And then we're talking about raw food, we're talking about vegan and plant-based and organic, and it's, we're starting to clear the road, and you can make better choices. Next time you go to the store, you make better choices. Thank you.
I think the first thing is to focus on the things upon which everybody agrees here. Everybody agrees that patients, consumers need to be informed. They need to be their own advocates. You need to make your own decisions about things, not just to make decisions that based on what somebody tells you, but because you understand. So we're all about patient empowerment. And I think the second thing is everybody who spoke at this conference agrees that diet has got to be part of your plan if you expect to achieve optimal health. And we may have had some disagreements up here about the minor things, but on the major point, which is whole foods, more plants, you don't see much disagreement. You just don't among experts. And so hang on to the things about which there was common agreement. You can sort out the little details on your own, and the little details are not what's standing between you and health. It's the big picture of being an informed consumer and adopting a health-promoting diet and lifestyle pattern that is important. And you guys all have enough information to do that now.
I also want to thank you, Stephen, for putting this wonderful conference on and for having me here. And yes, it's every bite matters, every choice matters, and little things, little steps, baby steps can be very progressive and be very, very beneficial. And you could see amazing results from following your intuitions and reading, and there's so much information out there. I mean, in the 20 years I've been doing this, to see the evolution of just even social media and the internet, where you have access to so much information, and we'll talk a lot about that tomorrow morning. It's a really exciting time, and I think that, yes, we have a lot of agreements and focus on, making those positive changes that everyone seems to agree on, because the little things don't matter. It's the big picture. It's the overall dietary pattern. It's the overall lifestyle.
I was talking to a patient the other day, and I was looking over their food log, and it was like bacon and eggs for breakfast, and cheeseburger. And I'm going over, and I said, okay, well, let's try to do this. Let's over here. I want you to eat some fruit. And he goes, I thought fruit was bad for you. And I'm like, so that's why, we might argue about little things about how much fruit and things to do, but I mean, the ridiculousness of the standard American diet. When I see human bodies just screaming from disease on a daily basis, and the cardiologist is treating the heart disease, and the diabetic doctor is treating the diabetes, and they're not looking at the person as a whole, and they're not realizing that both the diseases are coming because of what the person's eating. And that's what we got to concentrate on, and we are all in agreement on that. And in a second, we might differ on tofu or not, but I would send every patient I have over the Hippocrates Institute in a second before I would want to send them to a whole bunch of doctors. And so please keep that in mind. And I would just close out by saying, man, we are destroying the world. And as we sit here, 80 billion animals are screaming in torture, and bodies are screaming in hospitals, and we could cure all of that with one simple message, which is to eat plants.